The autumn air bit through my jacket as our school bus rumbled up the gravel road toward Cedar Ridge Environmental Camp in October 2018. I was 11 years old, starting my sixth grade year, and this three-day educational trip was supposed to teach us about environmental conservation and outdoor survival skills. The excitement that had filled our classroom weeks earlier had now transformed into nervous energy as we caught our first glimpse of the facility through the dusty bus windows. Cedar Ridge Camp looked nothing like the glossy brochures our teacher had shown us. The main lodge sat hunched against the tree line, its wood siding weathered gray and black with age and moisture, paint peeled from the window frames like diseased skin, and several shutters hung at odd angles, giving the building a lopsided, unsettling appearance. Behind the lodge, scattered throughout a clearing dotted with dying grass and muddy patches, stood our accommodations for the next 3 nights. The inequality became immediately apparent as we disembarked. The boys' cabin stood proudly on the eastern side of the camp, solid log structures with proper foundations, intact windows, and what appeared to be functional doors. Wisps of steam rose from vents on their roofs, suggesting working heating systems. The girls, however, were directed toward the western edge of the clearing, where a collection of structures that could generously be called rustic shelters awaited us. These weren't cabins in any traditional sense. They were essentially wooden frames wrapped in rough-hewn planks, with gaps between the boards wide enough to slip fingers through. The roofs consisted of corrugated metal sheets that had been patched multiple times with different materials, creating a patchwork of rust and mismatched colors. What should have been doors were simply openings covered by torn fly screens that fluttered in the wind like tattered flags of surrender. Camp Director Brennan, a heavy-set man with calloused hands and eyes that never quite met yours directly, gathered us around the flagpole for orientation. His voice carried an odd cadence, as if he were reading from a script he'd memorized long ago but no longer believed in. "Girls will be housed in the heritage accommodations," he announced with what might have been intended as enthusiasm. "These structures represent authentic frontier living conditions and will provide you with a genuine wilderness experience." The translation was clear. We were getting the worst housing because someone had decided that 11-year-old girls needed to be toughened up. The boys shuffled their feet and avoided eye contact, sensing the unfairness but saying nothing. Some of the girls began to whisper complaints, but Mrs. Henderson, our sixth-grade teacher, quickly shushed them with sharp looks and warnings about maintaining positive attitudes. As we dragged our sleeping bags and duffel bags toward our assigned shelter, the reality of our situation became even more stark. The wooden platforms that served as floors were uneven and splintered, with several boards loose enough to rock underfoot. The smell hit us immediately, a mixture of mildew, rotting wood, and something else underneath that I couldn't identify but that made my stomach turn slightly. Stains darkened various sections of the walls and ceiling, their origins unknown but their appearance ominous. Our shelter housed 12 girls from our class, divided between 2 rooms separated by a thin partition that didn't reach the ceiling. The lack of proper insulation meant that every sound echoed through both spaces, creating an environment where privacy was impossible and sleep would be a challenge even under the best circumstances. The floor plan was simple and brutal in its efficiency. Wooden platforms ran along the walls where we were expected to lay out our sleeping gear. There were no beds, no mattresses, and certainly no pillows provided. The camp staff had given us thin foam mats that compressed to almost nothing under body weight, offering about as much comfort as sleeping directly on the wooden boards themselves. Chloe Martinez was my best friend and had been assigned to the same room as me, along with 4 other girls from our class. Chloe was the type of person who could find something positive in almost any situation, but even her usual optimism faltered as we surveyed our accommodations. Her long brown hair kept getting caught on the splintered walls as she moved around the cramped space, and she had already discovered that the floor sloped noticeably toward one corner where water damage had caused the supports to sag. The other girls in our room were Victoria Chen, a quiet Asian girl who wore thick glasses and always carried a water bottle covered in science-themed stickers. Twins Madison and Morgan Sullivan, who insisted on keeping their sleeping bags side by side, and Amber Johnson, a tall girl with freckles, who had already started complaining loudly about everything from the smell to the lack of electrical outlets for her hairdryer. Victoria had claimed the corner spot farthest from the doorway, methodically arranging her belongings with the precision of someone who needed order to feel secure. She folded her clothes into perfect squares, lined up her toiletries in size order, and positioned her sleeping bag so that it aligned exactly with the wall boards. There was something almost obsessive about her organization, as if creating perfect order in her small space could somehow protect her from the chaos of our surroundings. The twins, Madison and Morgan, had inherited their mother's nervous energy and their father's tendency to fill silence with chatter. They moved around the room like mirror images of each other, unpacking identical belongings and commenting on every detail in overlapping sentences that created a constant stream of background noise. Their presence was both comforting and annoying. Comforting because they filled the space with familiar sounds, annoying because those sounds made it impossible to think clearly about our situation. Amber had positioned herself near the doorway, claiming she needed quick access to the bathroom during the night. She was the type of girl who had never experienced discomfort in her life, coming from a family where camping meant staying in cabins with running water and room service. Her complaints started immediately and continued in a steady stream that grated on everyone's nerves but that nobody had the energy to address directly. As darkness approached, the true nature of our accommodations became even more apparent. The torn fly screens that served as our doors offered no security and no protection from insects. Mosquitoes had already discovered our shelter and were beginning to gather in anticipatory clouds near the openings. The gaps between the wall boards allowed cold air to flow freely through the structure, and we could feel the temperature dropping as the sun disappeared behind the tree line. The inadequacy of our bedding became obvious as we attempted to create comfortable sleeping arrangements. The thin mats provided virtually no cushioning against the hard wooden platform, and our sleeping bags, designed for mild weather camping, offered little protection against the cold that seeped up through the floor. The realization that we would spend 3 nights in these conditions created a growing sense of dread that none of us wanted to acknowledge openly. By the afternoon of our first day, it became clear that the heritage accommodations were not just uncomfortable, they were actively undermining our health. The combination of cold temperatures, poor ventilation, and damp conditions had created a perfect breeding ground for respiratory infections. What started as a few sniffles during lunch had evolved into a full-blown epidemic by dinner time. The symptoms appeared almost simultaneously across both girls' shelters. First came the runny noses and scratchy throats, followed quickly by body aches and fever. Girls who had been energetic and excited during the morning orientation were now moving slowly, wrapped in jackets and sweaters, their faces flushed with fever and their voices reduced to hoarse whispers. Victoria was among the first to show serious symptoms. Her normally precise movements became sluggish and uncoordinated, and she had developed a cough that sounded disturbingly wet and deep. She continued to maintain her obsessive organization, but now it seemed to require enormous effort. I watched her rearrange her toiletries 3 times, each attempt taking longer than the last, as if her brain was struggling to process the familiar task. The twins, Madison and Morgan, had developed matching fevers that left them lying on their sleeping bags like deflated balloons. Their constant chatter had been reduced to occasional whispered exchanges between them, conversations in a language only they understood. Their mother had packed them identical care packages with medicine and throat lozenges, but the supplies were quickly depleted as other girls begged to share. Amber's complaints had taken on a desperate edge, as her symptoms worsened throughout the day. She had called her parents twice on her cell phone, demanding that they come pick her up immediately. When that failed, she had marched to the camp office and demanded to speak with Director Brennan, insisting that the accommodations were uninhabitable and possibly illegal. Her protests fell on deaf ears, but her increasingly erratic behavior was beginning to worry even those of us who found her annoying. Chloe and I had somehow managed to avoid the worst of the outbreak, though we could feel the early symptoms beginning to take hold. My throat was scratchy, and I had developed a headache that seemed to intensify whenever I moved too quickly. Chloe was fighting off a persistent cough that she tried to muffle in her sleeve to avoid disturbing the sick girls around us. We took it upon ourselves to play makeshift nurses for our roommates, a role that felt simultaneously important and terrifying. Neither of us had any real medical training beyond basic first aid, but we found ourselves taking temperatures with the digital thermometer Chloe's mother had packed, dispensing over-the-counter medications and trying to keep track of who had taken what and when. The responsibility was overwhelming. Victoria's fever had spiked to over 101 degrees, and her cough was producing a disturbing amount of phlegm that she spat into tissues with increasing frequency. The twins were shivering despite being wrapped in multiple layers, and their matching fevers seemed to be feeding off each other in some strange sympathetic response. Amber had stopped complaining and had instead become unnaturally quiet, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes that reflected the dim light in an unsettling way. The camp staff's response to the health crisis was minimal and inadequate. When we reported the situation to the counselors, they assured us that minor illnesses were normal during outdoor experiences, and that fresh air and physical activity would help everyone recover quickly. They provided additional blankets and suggested that the girls drink more water, but they showed no inclination to move anyone to better accommodations or to contact parents about the severity of the situation. As night approached, our shelter had transformed into something resembling a field hospital. Sick girls lay on their thin mats, wrapped in insufficient bedding, coughing and shivering in the cold air that continued to pour through the gaps in the walls. The sounds of illness, coughing, sniffling, moaning, and the rustle of tissues created a symphony of misery that made the space feel even more oppressive and claustrophobic. The second night brought new challenges that pushed our already strained situation beyond tolerable limits. The sick girls had finally managed to fall into fitful sleep around 10 o'clock, their coughs and moans creating a disturbing soundtrack that echoed through our thin-walled shelter. Chloe and I remained awake, partly because we were worried about our roommates, and partly because the sounds and smells of illness made rest impossible. We had positioned ourselves as close to the doorway as possible, hoping to catch some fresh air through the torn fly screen. The smell inside had become increasingly unpleasant as the day progressed, a mixture of medicine, fever sweat, and the underlying mustiness of the old building. The cold air that flowed through the gaps in the walls was uncomfortable, but it was preferable to the stagnant, sickly atmosphere that hung over the sleeping areas. Victoria had been restless all evening, tossing and turning on her mat, despite her fever-induced exhaustion. Her organizational obsessions had intensified with her illness, and she had spent nearly an hour before bedtime rearranging her belongings in increasingly complex patterns. Her water bottle, covered with its science-themed stickers, had become a particular focus of her attention. She positioned and repositioned it multiple times, measuring distances with her fingers and adjusting angles with mathematical precision. The disaster struck around 11:30, just as Chloe and I were beginning to think we might be able to get some sleep ourselves. Victoria, in the midst of one of her feverish movements, knocked over her water bottle with her elbow. The bottle, which she had apparently filled to capacity despite her illness, tipped and emptied its entire contents across the wooden platform. The water spread quickly across the uneven floor, flowing downhill toward the corner where my sleeping bag was positioned. I watched in horror as the cold liquid soaked through the fabric, saturating not just the exterior but seeping all the way through to the thin mat underneath. Within seconds, my entire sleeping arrangement was drenched in cold water that showed no signs of drying in the humid, unheated air of our shelter. The accident sent Victoria into a state of panic that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. She began apologizing repeatedly, her voice rising to a near hysteria that threatened to wake the other sick girls. Her obsessive tendencies kicked into overdrive as she tried to clean up the spill with tissues and clothing, but her feverish state made her movements clumsy and ineffective. She kept wiping the same spots over and over, muttering numbers under her breath as if she were trying to calculate the exact amount of water that had been spilled. I tried to reassure her that accidents happen and that the situation wasn't her fault, but my words seemed to make her agitation worse. She began rocking back and forth on her mat, clutching her empty water bottle against her chest like a security blanket. The fever had clearly affected her ability to process stress, and what should have been a minor inconvenience had become a major crisis in her compromised mental state. Chloe helped me wring out what water we could from my sleeping bag, but the damage was extensive. The fabric remained cold and damp, creating a sleeping surface that would be both uncomfortable and potentially dangerous in the already frigid conditions of our shelter. We hung the bag over one of the wooden beams, hoping it might dry somewhat before morning, but the humid air and lack of heating made this unlikely. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I had managed to avoid the worst of the illness epidemic that had struck down most of my roommates, only to find myself facing a night without adequate bedding in a building that offered no protection from the cold. The temperatures outside were dropping into the 40s, and the gaps in our walls meant that the interior temperature would likely match the exterior by morning. As I contemplated the prospect of spending the night shivering on a thin mat with no insulation, a disturbing thought occurred to me. Victoria's sleeping bag looked warm and dry, and Victoria herself appeared to be finally settling into sleep. The fever that had made her so agitated seemed to be providing her with enough internal heat that she had pushed her sleeping bag partially away from her body. It would be wrong to take advantage of a sick person's belongings, but my need for warmth was becoming desperate. The temperature continued to drop as midnight approached, and the sounds of illness that had filled our shelter throughout the evening began to subside into a restless quiet. The sick girls had finally exhausted themselves into sleep, though their rest was far from peaceful. Occasional coughs and moans punctuated the silence, creating an atmosphere of unease that made relaxation impossible even for those of us who remained relatively healthy. Chloe had developed a persistent cough that she tried to muffle in her sleeve, and I could hear the congestion building in her voice when she whispered to me across the narrow space between our mats. We both knew that she was beginning to succumb to whatever illness had struck down our roommates, but neither of us wanted to acknowledge it directly. The thought of both of us becoming sick while trapped in these inadequate accommodations was too frightening to contemplate. The twins, Madison and Morgan, had finally stopped their restless tossing and had settled into a synchronized sleep pattern that was both touching and unnerving. They faced each other on their adjacent mats, their breathing falling into the same rhythm, their movements mirroring each other even in unconsciousness. Their matching fevers had given their faces an identical flush that made them look like dolls rather than real children. Amber had become increasingly quiet as her illness progressed, and her silence was somehow more disturbing than her previous complaints had been. She lay motionless on her mat, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes that reflected the dim light filtering through the torn screens. When I whispered her name to check on her condition, she turned her head toward me with mechanical precision but didn't respond verbally. Her fever had clearly reached a level that was affecting her cognitive function. Victoria remained the sickest of our group, but her fever seemed to have stabilized somewhat after the water bottle incident. She had arranged herself in her sleeping bag with the same obsessive precision that characterized all her actions, positioning her body in perfect alignment with the wallboards and placing her belongings within exact reaching distances. Her breathing had taken on a wet, rattling quality that suggested her cold had developed into something more serious. The cold was becoming unbearable for me without proper bedding. My damp sleeping bag hung uselessly from the wooden beam where Chloe and I had positioned it, showing no signs of drying in the humid air. The thin mat provided no insulation against the wooden platform, and I could feel the cold seeping up through my clothing and into my bones. My muscles had begun to cramp from shivering, and my teeth chattered despite my efforts to control them. Chloe noticed my deteriorating condition and whispered suggestions for staying warm. We tried sharing her sleeping bag, but it was designed for one person and provided inadequate coverage for both of us. We experimented with using our jackets and extra clothing as blankets, but the cold air flowing through the wall gaps made any improvised bedding system ineffective. The thought of Victoria's warm, dry sleeping bag became increasingly tempting as my condition worsened. She appeared to be generating enough body heat from her fever that she had partially unzipped her bag and kicked off some of her covers. The contrast between her apparent warmth and my increasing cold created a situation that tested my moral boundaries. Taking advantage of a sick person's belongings was wrong, but hypothermia was a real possibility if I couldn't find adequate warmth. As I wrestled with this ethical dilemma, I began to focus more intently on Victoria's movements and sounds. Her breathing had settled into a regular pattern that suggested deep sleep, and her obsessive fidgeting had finally ceased. She appeared to be genuinely unconscious, lost in whatever feverish dreams had taken hold of her compromised mind. The decision to appropriate her sleeping bag, even temporarily, felt like crossing a moral line that would define my character for years to come. But the alternative, spending the remaining hours until dawn shivering on a thin mat in a building that offered no protection from the elements, seemed equally unacceptable. My physical need for warmth was beginning to override my ethical concerns about taking advantage of Victoria's condition. Around 1:30 in the morning, as I lay shivering on my inadequate mat and contemplating the ethics of sleeping bag theft, a movement from Victoria's corner caught my attention. Through the dim light that filtered through our torn screens, I saw her sit up slowly and methodically begin to gather specific items from her precisely arranged belongings. Her movements were deliberate and purposeful, lacking the feverish agitation that had characterized her behavior earlier in the evening. She picked up her thick-rimmed glasses and positioned them carefully on her face, adjusting them twice to ensure perfect alignment. Her water bottle, the same one that had caused my soggy sleeping bag disaster, was retrieved from its designated spot and examined briefly before being tucked under her arm. I watched with growing curiosity as Victoria stood up with surprising steadiness for someone who had been running a high fever just hours earlier. She moved with the mechanical precision that I had come to associate with her obsessive tendencies, but there was something different about her demeanor. Gone was the nervous energy and constant fidgeting that usually characterized her actions. Instead, she moved with a calm determination that seemed inconsistent with her illness. She stepped carefully over the sleeping forms of the twins, Madison and Morgan, avoiding the specific spots where their belongings were arranged. Her path to the doorway followed a precise line that suggested she had planned this route in advance, taking into account the positions of everyone in the room and the placement of all obstacles. There was something almost robotic about her navigation through the cramped space. At the doorway, Victoria paused and turned to look back into the room. The gesture seemed routine, as if she were checking to ensure she hadn't forgotten anything important. Her gaze swept across the sleeping forms of our roommates before settling briefly on me. I forced my breathing to remain steady and kept my eyes nearly closed, not wanting her to know I was awake and observing her movements. Satisfied with her inspection, Victoria pushed through the torn fly screen and disappeared into the night. Through the doorway, I could see her figure moving across the muddy clearing toward the bathroom facilities that sat approximately 3 minutes' walk from our shelter. The moon provided enough light to track her progress as she walked with the same measured, purposeful gait that had characterized her indoor movements. Chloe, who had been lying quietly on her mat beside me, shifted slightly and whispered my name. I turned to see that she was also awake and had been watching Victoria's departure with the same curiosity that had captured my attention. Her cough had worsened over the past hour, and I could hear the congestion in her voice when she spoke. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of our sleeping roommates. She moved like she wasn't even sick anymore. "And did you notice how she picked up specific things? Like she had a plan?" I nodded, struck by the same observations. Victoria's behavior had seemed inconsistent with someone suffering from a high fever and respiratory infection. Her movements had been too coordinated, too purposeful, too devoid of the confusion and disorientation that had marked her actions throughout the day. Something about her midnight bathroom trip felt deliberate in a way that routine biological needs typically don't. We lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of our sick roommates and waiting for Victoria's return. The bathroom facilities were visible from our doorway, and we would be able to see her emerge and begin her walk back to the shelter. The entire round trip should take no more than 10 minutes, allowing for the slow, careful movement that someone with her symptoms would require. But as the minutes ticked by, Victoria failed to reappear. Chloe and I began to grow concerned about her welfare, imagining scenarios where her fever had caused her to become disoriented, or where she had collapsed somewhere between the bathroom and our shelter. The thought of a sick 11-year-old girl wandering around in the cold darkness created a growing sense of anxiety that made our own discomfort seem trivial. After approximately 15 minutes had passed without Victoria's return, Chloe's concern overrode her own illness-induced lethargy. She struggled to her feet, wrapping her jacket tightly around her shoulders and preparing to venture out into the cold night air to check on our missing roommate. The prospect of leaving our inadequate but familiar shelter was daunting, but the possibility that Victoria needed help made inaction seem irresponsible. "I'll go check the bathrooms," Chloe whispered, her voice hoarse from her developing cold. "Maybe she got sick in there and needs help, or maybe she's too weak to walk back on her own. You stay here and keep an eye on everyone else in case something happens." I agreed to remain in the shelter, partly because someone needed to monitor our other sick roommates, and partly because I was reluctant to leave what little warmth I had managed to preserve under my makeshift bedding arrangement. The thought of Victoria collapsed or disoriented in the bathroom facilities created images in my mind that were difficult to dismiss, but my own physical condition was deteriorating rapidly in the cold. Chloe pushed through the torn fly screen and disappeared into the darkness, following the same path that Victoria had taken 20 minutes earlier. I watched through the doorway as her figure moved slowly across the clearing, her gait unsteady due to her illness but her determination clear in her purposeful movement toward the distant bathroom building. While waiting for Chloe's return, I took the opportunity to address my sleeping situation. The cold had become unbearable, and my shivering was now violent enough to make my muscles ache. Victoria's absence presented an opportunity to temporarily use her sleeping bag without technically stealing from a sick person, since she had voluntarily left it behind when she departed for the bathroom. I moved carefully toward Victoria's corner, stepping over the sleeping forms of Madison and Morgan with the same precision that Victoria herself had demonstrated. Her sleeping bag lay open and inviting, still retaining the warmth from her feverish body. The contrast between its obvious comfort and my own cold misery made the decision to appropriate it temporarily seem not only justified but necessary for my survival. As I approached Victoria's meticulously organized sleeping area, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The sleeping bag was not empty as I had expected. Instead, a human form lay beneath the covers, positioned with the same precise alignment that characterized all of Victoria's arrangements. The sleeping bag was zipped up to neck level, and a head rested on the makeshift pillow, turned away from me toward the wall. Confusion flooded my mind as I tried to process this impossible situation. I had clearly seen Victoria get up, gather her belongings, and leave the shelter 20 minutes earlier. Chloe had witnessed the same sequence of events, confirming that my fever-addled brain wasn't playing tricks on me. Yet here was unmistakable evidence that Victoria had never left her sleeping bag at all. I stood frozen in the darkness, my mind struggling to reconcile what I had observed with what I was seeing. The figure in the sleeping bag was breathing with the same wet, rattling pattern that had characterized Victoria's illness throughout the day. The size and shape of the form beneath the covers matched Victoria's petite frame perfectly. Even the positioning of the body reflected her obsessive need for precise alignment with surrounding structures. My first thought was that I had been hallucinating due to my own developing illness and the stress of our situation. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and worry could easily have caused my brain to create false memories or to misinterpret normal movements as something more significant. But Chloe had seen the same thing, and her illness was less advanced than mine. My second thought was that Victoria had somehow returned while I wasn't paying attention. Perhaps while I was focused on navigating around the twins or distracted by my own discomfort. But this explanation didn't account for the timing. Chloe had left to check on Victoria only minutes earlier, and there had been no opportunity for Victoria to return without being seen. As I stood there trying to understand the situation, I heard footsteps approaching across the clearing outside. Chloe was returning from her bathroom expedition, and her pace suggested urgency or distress. I quickly moved away from Victoria's sleeping area and positioned myself near the doorway to hear her report. Chloe pushed through the torn screen with obvious agitation. Her breathing labored from both her illness and her hurried movement across the uneven ground. Her face was flushed with fever and exertion, and her eyes held a confused, frightened expression that matched my own growing unease about the situation. "She's not there," Chloe whispered urgently. I checked both bathroom buildings and walked around the entire area. There's no sign of Victoria anywhere. It's like she just disappeared into thin air. The impossibility of our situation crystallized in my mind as Chloe delivered her report. Victoria was simultaneously absent from the bathroom facilities where we had seen her go and present in her sleeping bag where she had never left. The logical contradictions were giving me a headache that competed with my existing cold symptoms and sleep deprivation. "Chloe," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the darkness. "Look at Victoria's sleeping bag." Chloe turned toward Victoria's corner, following my gaze to where the familiar form lay beneath the covers. I watched her face as the same confusion that had gripped me began to register in her expression. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again as she struggled to find words for something that had no logical explanation. "That's impossible," she breathed, moving closer to get a better look at the sleeping figure. We both saw her get up. We both watched her walk to the bathroom. She had her glasses, her water bottle, everything. How can she be here? We stood together in the darkness, staring at Victoria's sleeping form, and trying to reconcile our shared memories with the evidence before us. The figure in the sleeping bag continued to breathe with the wet, congested rhythm that had marked Victoria's illness throughout the day. Everything about the scene suggested that she had never moved from her precisely arranged sleeping area. I approached Victoria's sleeping bag with growing trepidation, needing to confirm what my eyes were telling me, but fearing what I might discover. As I got closer, I could see that her water bottle, the same one she had carried on her supposed bathroom trip, sat in its designated spot among her other belongings, positioned with the mathematical precision that characterized all her arrangements. "Victoria," I whispered softly, not wanting to wake the other girls but needing to understand what was happening. "Are you okay?" The figure in the sleeping bag stirred slightly at the sound of my voice, turning toward me with movements that seemed sluggish and disoriented. In the dim light filtering through our torn screens, I could see Victoria's face, flushed with fever and wearing the confused expression of someone emerging from deep sleep. Her thick glasses sat on her face in perfect position, despite the fact that I had clearly seen her put them on before leaving the shelter. "What?" Victoria mumbled, her voice thick with congestion and sleep. "What's wrong? What time is it?" "Did you just go to the bathroom?" Chloe asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Victoria's confusion deepened as she processed the question. She pushed herself up slightly on her elbows, wincing at the movement, and looked around the shelter as if trying to orient herself. Her gaze moved from Chloe to me, then to the other sleeping girls, before returning to us with growing bewilderment. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice gaining strength as she became more fully awake. "I haven't been anywhere. I've been sleeping here all night. I feel awful. My fever is really high, and I can barely breathe. Why would you think I went somewhere?" The certainty in her voice was as disturbing as everything else about the situation. Victoria wasn't lying or trying to cover up a midnight adventure. Her confusion appeared genuine, and her physical condition suggested that she had indeed been lying in her sleeping bag for hours, fighting off the illness that had struck down most of our roommates. Chloe and I exchanged glances that communicated our shared bewilderment and growing fear. We had both witnessed the same sequence of events with crystal clarity. We had seen Victoria rise from her sleeping bag, gather her belongings, and walk purposefully toward the bathroom facilities. We had tracked her movement across the clearing until she disappeared into the distant building. Yet here she was, insisting with complete conviction that she had never moved. "But we saw you," I insisted, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself and returned to a whisper. "You got up around 1:30. You put on your glasses, picked up your water bottle, and walked to the bathroom. We watched you leave." Victoria's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm. She sat up fully, ignoring the obvious discomfort the movement caused her, and stared at us with wide eyes that reflected genuine fear. Her obsessive tendencies kicked in as she began checking her belongings, counting items and verifying their positions with frantic precision. "My glasses never left my face," she said, her voice taking on the rapid, anxious quality that marked her most distressed moments. "My water bottle is exactly where I put it before going to sleep. All my things are in the same positions. I arranged everything specifically, and I would know if anything had been moved." The conviction in her voice was unshakable, but so were our own memories of what we had witnessed. As we stood there in the cold darkness of our inadequate shelter, surrounded by the sounds of sick children and the smell of illness and dampness, we were confronted with a truth that refused to conform to logical explanation. Chloe's developing illness made her more emotional than usual, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes as she struggled to process the situation. The stress of our accommodations, the health crisis affecting our group, and now this inexplicable contradiction between memory and reality was pushing her toward a breakdown that would help no one. "Maybe we're sicker than we thought," she whispered, her voice cracking with strain. "Maybe the fever is making us hallucinate or remember things that didn't happen. Maybe we should try to get some sleep and see if everything makes more sense in the morning." But even as she suggested this rational explanation, none of us believed it. Our memories were too vivid, too detailed, too consistent between two different observers to be dismissed as fever dreams or hallucinations. Something had happened in our shelter that night, something that challenged our understanding of reality itself. Victoria settled back into her sleeping bag, but her movements were agitated, and her eyes remained wide with fear. She began rearranging her belongings again, checking and rechecking their positions, as if the familiar ritual could somehow restore order to a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. As dawn approached and the first gray light began to filter through our torn screens, we remained awake, each lost in our own thoughts about what we had experienced. The official explanation would be that stress and illness had caused a shared delusion, a perfectly rational conclusion that satisfied the adults but failed to account for the precise details we both remembered. Even now, years later, I can recall every detail of that night with perfect clarity. The way Victoria moved with mechanical precision, the sound of her breathing, the exact items she carried, the path she took across the muddy clearing. Chloe remembers the same details, described in the same sequence, with the same disturbing accuracy. We never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened at Cedar Ridge Camp that October night in 2018. Victoria continued to experience unusual incidents throughout her life, as if that moment had opened a door that could never be completely closed. But for Chloe and me, it remains a single, inexplicable event that taught us that reality is far more fragile and mysterious than we had ever imagined. The memory still makes me shiver, though whether from cold or fear, I can never be certain. When I was young, my parents would abandon me at my grandparents' house in Millfield almost every other weekend during the late 1990s. They lived in this decrepit two-story Victorian with rotting wood siding and too many rooms that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. The place always reeked of mothballs and decay, mixed with whatever my grandmother was attempting to salvage from her ancient cookbooks. It wasn't the worst arrangement. I received stale cookies and dangerous amounts of neglect, except for one horrifying reality. Bruno. Bruno was my grandfather's obsession, a massive German shepherd that he'd acquired before my birth. By the time I was forming coherent memories around age 4, Bruno was already a seasoned predator disguised as a family pet. My grandfather Edmund had molded him through brutal training regimens for regional intimidation competitions when Bruno was younger. The basement wall displayed his grotesque trophies, ribbons and photographs of Bruno looking menacing beside my grandfather's twisted grin. To every visiting neighbor and family friend, Bruno represented the pinnacle of canine discipline and intelligence. To me, he embodied pure terror, given flesh and fur. The house itself seemed to conspire with Bruno's malevolence. Shadows lingered too long in corners where they had no business existing. Floorboards groaned under invisible weight during the darkest hours. Windows rattled without wind, and doors creaked open on their own, as if the structure itself was breathing. Shallow, labored breaths that matched the rhythm of Bruno's constant panting. My grandmother, Constance, treated Bruno like the son she never had, feeding him raw meat by hand while crooning disturbing lullabies in a voice that made my skin crawl. She would ask Bruno if he wanted another piece of bleeding steak in that sickening baby voice, answering herself that yes, of course he did. He was such a good boy, such a perfect boy. Meanwhile, I spent every waking moment calculating escape routes and safe hiding spots throughout that cursed house. The adults never witnessed Bruno's true nature. Their blindness to his malevolence was absolute and terrifying. How could they not see what was happening right in front of them? How could they miss the calculated intelligence burning behind those yellow eyes, the way his lips would curl into something resembling a human smirk when he thought no one was watching? The first time I understood that something fundamentally wrong existed within Bruno's skull, I was barely 5 years old. I was sprawled across the kitchen linoleum with my coloring books while my grandmother prepared what she generously called lunch. Bruno lay beneath the scratched wooden table, supposedly sleeping off his morning meal of God knows what. I accidentally dropped my red crayon, the one I was using to color a fire truck, and when I reached down to retrieve it, Bruno's eyes snapped open with mechanical precision. Those weren't the warm, dopey eyes of a normal dog. They were completely focused, calculating, almost human in their malicious intelligence. He didn't growl or bare his yellowed teeth. That would have been easier to explain to the adults who insisted on treating him like a beloved family member. Instead, he simply stared at me with those cold, predatory eyes, and I swear to God he smiled. Not the happy, tongue-lolling grin that people mistake for canine joy, but something knowing and cruel and hungry. His black lips pulled back just enough to reveal the tips of his canine teeth, and his eyes narrowed with what I can only describe as amusement. It was the look of something that understood exactly how vulnerable I was, how completely at his mercy I remained. I yanked my hand back so violently that I struck my knuckles against the table leg hard enough to draw blood. The sharp pain barely registered through my terror. When I tried to explain what happened to my grandmother, she laughed it off with that dismissive chuckle adults use when children report things that don't fit their comfortable worldview. She insisted that Bruno adored children and was probably just playing with me, being friendly. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next decade of my life. Whenever adults were present, Bruno performed his role as the perfect family pet with Academy Award-worthy precision. The moment they turned away, even for seconds, he transformed into something else entirely, something that watched and waited and planned with frightening intelligence. My grandfather constantly bragged about Bruno to anyone who would listen, claiming he was the smartest dog he'd ever encountered. He would often remark, with obvious pride, that sometimes he believed Bruno understood every word of human conversation. My grandmother was equally deluded, hand-feeding him chunks of raw meat while speaking to him in that nauseating baby voice that made my stomach turn. I learned quickly that the adults would never believe me about Bruno's behavior. After all, he was such a good dog, so well-trained, so intelligent. When I was 7, I was playing alone in the backyard while my grandparents tended their withering garden. I had this plastic action figure, a superhero whose name escapes me now, that I'd received for my birthday. I set the toy down for maybe 30 seconds to retie my sneaker. When I looked up, Bruno was standing directly over my action figure, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the bright plastic colors. He stared directly into my eyes with that same calculating expression I'd learned to fear, then slowly, deliberately picked up the toy in his massive jaws. The sound of plastic cracking between his teeth was obscenely loud in the afternoon silence. He applied pressure gradually, methodically, like someone carefully breaking each bone in a small animal. The action figure's arms snapped first, then the legs, then the torso crumpled with a sickening crunch. Throughout this destruction, Bruno never broke eye contact with me. His tail wagged in slow, deliberate sweeps, like a metronome keeping time with my increasing terror. When he finished destroying my toy, he dropped the mangled remains at my feet with ceremonial precision, then walked away with his tail high and his step jaunty, as if he'd accomplished something worth celebrating. The mutilated plastic looked like the remains of something that had been alive, something that had suffered. When I ran crying to my grandmother, she scolded me for leaving my toys where poor Bruno could mistake them for his own playthings. My grandfather handed me 5 crumpled dollar bills and told me to be more careful next time, to think about how confusing it must be for a dog to see unfamiliar objects in his territory. Their complete inability to see what was happening felt like a form of madness. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining things that weren't there? But the destroyed toy in my hands was real enough, and the memory of Bruno's calculating smile burned behind my eyelids every time I tried to sleep. The worst incident occurred when I was 9 years old, during a particularly dark October weekend. I was sleeping in the guest room at the end of the upstairs hallway, a room that always smelled like dust and old death, where the wallpaper peeled in long strips that resembled diseased skin. I woke around midnight with my bladder demanding attention. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel into hell, dark and seemingly endless. I didn't want to wake anyone by turning on lights, so I crept toward the bathroom using the faint moonlight filtering through grimy windows. Halfway down the hall, I heard the familiar click of nails on hardwood. Bruno materialized at the far end of the corridor, just a hulking silhouette against the lesser darkness. He stood perfectly motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Something about his posture was wrong, unnatural. He wasn't standing like a normal dog. He was too still, too purposeful, like a predator that had caught the scent of wounded prey. I took one step backward toward my room, and he took one step forward. I stepped back again, and he mirrored my movement exactly. It was like some twisted dance, some perverse game where the rules were written in my terror and his amusement. His breathing was audible now, deep, controlled inhalations and exhalations that sounded almost human. When I finally turned to run back to my room, I heard him coming after me. Not the clumsy gallop of an excited dog, but measured, calculated steps that seemed to match my own panicked rhythm. I barely made it through my door before slamming it shut and turning the lock with shaking fingers. Bruno hit the door with tremendous force, making the entire frame shudder. Then came silence, the kind of complete quiet that feels more threatening than any sound. I stood there trembling, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Then I heard it, scratching at the door. Not the frantic clawing of a dog that wanted inside, but deliberate, methodical gouging. The sound was rhythmic, almost artistic, as if he was carving something meaningful into the wood. It continued for nearly 2 hours before stopping. In the morning, there were deep gouges in the bottom of the door, not random scratches, but deliberate marks that almost looked like letters or symbols. My grandfather examined the damage with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger at his precious dog, but something closer to fear. For the first time, I saw doubt in an adult's eyes when they looked at Bruno. My grandfather stared at those scratches for a long time, then at Bruno, then back at the scratches. He mumbled something about this not being like Bruno at all, about never seeing behavior like this before. But there was something in his voice, something that suggested maybe he had seen things he couldn't explain. When I was 11, Bruno died, and I wish I could claim to feel anything other than overwhelming relief. I was staying with my grandparents that particular weekend when it happened, and Bruno had been acting stranger than usual all day, more aggressive, more unpredictable. He'd spent hours pacing through the house, his nails clicking incessantly on the hardwood floors like some demented percussion instrument. He would stop randomly in doorways, staring at empty spaces as if he could see things the rest of us couldn't. His growling was constant and low, directed at shadows and corners where nothing visible lurked. That night, his behavior escalated to the point where my grandfather had to physically drag him to the basement and lock him in. Even through the thick wooden door and down a full flight of stairs, we could hear Bruno's barking. Not normal dog barking, but something that sounded almost like screaming. The sounds were rhythmic and deliberate, as if he was trying to communicate something urgent and terrible. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to complete silence. The kind of absolute quiet that feels wrong when you're accustomed to the normal creaks and sighs of an old house. I lay there in the darkness, suddenly aware that I couldn't hear Bruno anymore. No barking, no pacing, no scratching, nothing. The silence was somehow more terrifying than his noise had been. It felt heavy and expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pulled my blankets over my head and tried to convince myself that Bruno had simply tired himself out and fallen asleep. In the morning, my grandfather found him at the bottom of the basement stairs, dead. The veterinarian later determined it was a massive heart attack, apparently common for his age and breed. Natural causes, nothing suspicious, case closed. But what the veterinarian didn't see, what my grandmother quickly ushered me away from before I could examine too closely, was Bruno's expression. His lips were pulled back in what looked like a snarl of pure rage, his eyes wide open and staring at something only he could see. His front paws were extended as if he'd been reaching for something at the moment of death. He didn't look peaceful. He didn't look like he'd simply succumbed to age and genetics. He looked furious, cheated, as if death had interrupted something important he'd been planning to accomplish. I thought that would be the end of Bruno's reign of terror. I was catastrophically wrong. 3 months after Bruno's death, I arrived for another weekend visit to discover something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, positioned near my grandfather's favorite leather armchair in the den, was Bruno, stuffed and mounted in a standing position that captured him at his most intimidating. The taxidermist had done exceptional work. Bruno's fur had been expertly groomed and positioned, his posture regal and alert, exactly like in those competition photographs that still lined the basement walls. His mouth was slightly open, revealing those yellowed canine teeth that had haunted my nightmares for years. But something was wrong with his eyes. They were glass, obviously artificial, but they seemed to track movement around the room. No matter where I stood, those dead eyes followed me with the same calculating intelligence I remembered from life. The taxidermist had somehow captured the essence of Bruno's malevolent personality and trapped it behind those glassy windows. My grandfather beamed with pride as he asked if I thought Bruno looked magnificent. He explained that now Bruno would always be with them, watching over the family, protecting the house. My grandmother seemed less enthusiastic about the arrangement, but she supported her husband's decision with the kind of resigned acceptance that comes after decades of marriage. She explained quietly that my grandfather couldn't bear to part with Bruno, that this was his way of processing grief. but there was something in her voice, something that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with having a dead dog standing guard in their living room. That night was the first time I experienced what would become a terrifying pattern. I was reading in bed when I heard it, the familiar click of nails on hardwood in the hallway outside my room. The same measured rhythm, the same deliberate pace that had terrorized me for years. My door, which I was certain I'd closed and locked, stood slightly ajar. Through that gap, I could see nothing but darkness, but I felt something watching me with predatory patience. I sat paralyzed, staring at that opening, certain I would see Bruno's face appear in the shadows. Nothing materialized, but the feeling of being observed was overwhelming. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, the hallway was empty. I looked down the stairs toward the den, where I could see Bruno's taxidermied form in the dim light, exactly where it had been earlier, unchanging, motionless, dead. I barricaded my door with a chair and barely slept that night. In the morning, I found small, dusty paw prints on the hardwood outside my room, prints that looked exactly like Bruno's, but that was impossible. When I showed my grandmother, she frowned and muttered something about the neighbor's cat somehow getting inside, but we both knew the neighbors didn't have pets. Over the next 2 years, my weekend visits became exercises in psychological torture. Objects would move around the house, usually my belongings, displaced or hidden in locations where I'd never left them. I'd find my backpack unzipped, homework scattered across floors like confetti. My clothes would be pulled from drawers and arranged in strange patterns that almost looked deliberate. Once I discovered my sneaker in the backyard garden, chewed beyond recognition and covered in fresh saliva that couldn't be explained. The shoe looked like it had been savaged by something with powerful jaws and a taste for destruction. The taxidermied Bruno never seemed to move. At least, I never caught him in the act. But sometimes I'd enter the den and find him facing a different direction than I remembered. When I'd mention this to my grandparents, they'd insist nothing had changed, that my memory was playing tricks on me. The incidents escalated gradually, systematically, like a carefully planned campaign of terror. I'd wake up to find my blankets pulled off during the night, scattered on the floor as if something had been searching underneath them. I'd feel pressure at the foot of my bed, like a large animal settling down to sleep, but nothing was ever there when I turned on the lights. The clicking of nails became a regular nighttime occurrence, always stopping just outside my door. Sometimes I could hear breathing, deep, controlled inhalations and exhalations that sounded too measured to be natural. On particularly bad nights, I could hear what sounded like scratching inside the walls, as if something was trying to claw its way out from within the house's structure. My parents thought I was having behavioral problems. My grandparents were concerned but helpless. They never experienced anything themselves, which made my reports sound like the fantasies of an unstable child. My grandfather would suggest that maybe the old house was just settling, but I could tell he was troubled by something he couldn't articulate. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the taxidermied Bruno with an expression of uncertainty, as if he was beginning to question the wisdom of preserving his beloved pet. There were moments when he seemed to be listening to sounds only he could hear, his head tilted and his eyes distant. The final incident happened when I was 14, during what I promised myself would be my last overnight stay at that cursed house. It was spring break of 2003, and my grandparents had gone to bed early, leaving me alone with the television and my growing dread. I must have dozed off on the living room couch because I woke suddenly around midnight to find the television still broadcasting some late-night talk show. I had that unmistakable feeling of being watched, that primitive awareness that predators instill in their prey. The taxidermied Bruno was gone from his usual position near my grandfather's chair. The empty space where he'd stood seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I sat up fully, my heart racing as I scanned the dark room. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe my grandfather had moved him for cleaning, or perhaps the mounting had finally given way. But deep in my bones I knew that wasn't the case. Something was happening, something that defied every logical explanation I could construct. I decided to retreat to my room upstairs, moving as quietly as possible through the house that seemed to breathe around me. Each step on the old staircase seemed to echo louder than it should have, as if the house itself was announcing my presence to whatever lurked in the shadows. When I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it, the clicking of nails on hardwood coming from my room. Not the remembered echo of past terror, but immediate, present, real. I should have run to my grandparents' room, should have screamed for help, but fear paralyzed my legs and stole my voice. I approached my bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar, and pushed it open with a trembling hand. There, in the center of my room, was Bruno. Not the stiff, artificial construct of the taxidermist, but something else entirely, something that defied every natural law I'd been taught to trust. He looked solid, but somehow wrong, like a photograph that had been poorly developed. His fur was dull and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His movements were jerky and unnatural, but his eyes, those yellow, calculating eyes, were exactly as I remembered them from life, burning with malicious intelligence and patient hunger. When he saw me, his mouth opened in what could only be described as a smile, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally white in the darkness. The expression was so human, so deliberately cruel, that my mind recoiled from processing what I was seeing. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch in paralyzed terror as he slowly approached me, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor with each deliberate step. When he was directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the musty odor of death and preservation chemicals, he stopped. For a moment that lasted an eternity. Nothing happened. We stared at each other across the impossible gap between life and death, between sanity and madness. Then, faster than thought, he lunged forward and seized a mouthful of my hair in his jaws. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but it also broke the spell of terror that had held me motionless. I screamed as Bruno began dragging me by my hair toward the hallway, his supernatural strength easily overcoming my desperate struggles. I clawed at the doorframe, trying to grab onto something, anything that might anchor me to safety. My screams finally penetrated the thick walls and woke my grandparents. I heard their bedroom door slam open and their frantic footsteps in the hallway. My grandfather's voice called out, asking what was happening, then stopped mid-sentence as he rounded the corner and saw what was occurring. The moment the hallway light blazed on, Bruno vanished. Not ran away, not released me and fled, simply ceased to exist, as if he'd been nothing more than a shadow that couldn't survive illumination. 1 second he was there, solid and real and terrifying, gripping my hair with supernatural strength. The next second I was alone, collapsed on the floor, and sobbing uncontrollably. My grandmother helped me to my feet while my grandfather stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the empty space where Bruno had been. His face was completely drained of color, his eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from having your fundamental understanding of reality shattered. I asked him through my tears if he had seen it too, if I wasn't going insane. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper as he admitted that he had seen something that shouldn't have been possible. That night, while I lay trembling in my grandparents' bed, there was no way I was sleeping alone, I heard my grandfather go downstairs. There was silence for a long time, then the sound of the back door opening and closing. Heavy footsteps crossed the backyard, followed by the distinctive sound of a shovel biting into earth. In the morning, the taxidermied Bruno was gone. My grandfather refused to tell me exactly what he'd done with it, only saying that it had been taken care of, that some things shouldn't be preserved, that some doors, once opened, are difficult to close. He finally admitted that he'd been experiencing things too. Objects moved, strange noises, a persistent feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. He'd dismissed it all, convinced it was just grief and imagination playing tricks on his aging mind. I never stayed overnight at my grandparents' house again. My parents didn't understand my refusal, but they respected it after seeing the genuine terror in my eyes whenever the subject was mentioned. Years later, after both my grandparents had passed away and we were cleaning out their house, I found a small metal box buried in the backyard garden under an unmarked stone. Inside was a dog collar, worn and faded, with the name Bruno barely visible on the tarnished tag. Next to it was a note in my grandfather's shaking handwriting. Some doors, once opened, are hard to close. Some love becomes something else in the dark. May God forgive me for what I tried to keep. I reburied the box exactly where I found it, and never told anyone about the discovery. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. I still sometimes wake in the night to the phantom sound of nails clicking on hardwood, and I know that somewhere, in the space between life and death, Bruno is still hunting. But as long as his remains stay buried and forgotten, as long as no one else tries to preserve what should be allowed to die, I think the door will remain closed. The house in Millfield was eventually demolished. The new owners complained of strange sounds and unexplained phenomena, but they attributed it to the age of the structure. When the bulldozers finally came, I felt something that might have been relief. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if destroying the house was enough. I wonder if some forms of love, twisted by grief and denial, can survive even the destruction of their earthly anchors. I wonder, and I try not to listen too carefully to the sounds outside my bedroom door. I was 16, a sophomore at Lincoln High back in 2012, and absolutely nothing about me screamed, "cool kid." Neither did my best friend Danny. We'd been inseparable since kindergarten, two socially awkward kids who found refuge in anime, video games, and our shared inability to talk to girls without our voices cracking. Danny came over every weekend without fail, and we'd lose ourselves in whatever new series we'd discovered or spend hours grinding levels in whatever RPG had caught our attention. That particular Friday in October, we were huddled around my laptop in the computer lab during lunch period. Danny had been bragging all week about some premium content he'd gotten from a Discord server. Rare anime episodes, exclusive manga chapters, the kind of stuff that made us feel like we were part of some secret club. I watched him navigate through folders with names like Ultra Rare and Limited Edition, my curiosity growing with each click. "Dude, check this out," Danny whispered, his fingers hovering over a folder labeled Premium Content. His eyes had that mischievous glint that usually meant trouble, but I leaned in anyway. The folder opened to reveal dozens of files with suggestive thumbnails and titles that made my face burn red. It wasn't anything too extreme by internet standards, but for two sheltered 16-year-olds it might as well have been contraband. We were so absorbed in our discovery that we didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching behind us. Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through our whispered excitement like a blade. "What exactly are you two looking at?" The entire computer lab fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward us as Danny frantically tried to close the browser windows, his mouse clicking wildly as more inappropriate images flashed across the screen. Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted from curiosity to disgust to stern disapproval in the span of 3 seconds. My stomach dropped so fast, I thought I might actually throw up right there on the keyboard. "Principal's office. Now," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. The walk to the principal's office felt like a death march, with students in the hallway staring and whispering as we passed. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, and Danny looked like he was about to cry. Principal Rodriguez didn't waste time with pleasantries. Within an hour, both sets of parents had been called. The conversation was brief, clinical, and mortifying. Words like inappropriate material and serious violation of school policy echoed in my ears as I sat there wanting to disappear into the floor. Dad picked me up in his old pickup truck, and the silence during the drive home was suffocating. I could feel his disappointment radiating from the driver's seat like heat from a furnace. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he sat there for a long moment with the engine running, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. "I talked to Mr. Stevens," he finally said, referring to Danny's father. "You boys have two options. You can be grounded for a month, no internet, no games, no leaving the house except for school. Or you can come hunting with me this weekend." He turned to look at me, his gray eyes serious. Your choice, but you're both getting the same punishment. That night, Danny and I texted back and forth for hours, weighing our options. A month without internet felt like a death sentence, but hunting wasn't exactly appealing either. Neither of us had ever been hunting before, and the idea of killing animals made us both uncomfortable. But Dad had been trying to get me to go hunting with him for years, always saying it would make a man out of me or teach me about the real world. I'd always found excuses to avoid it. At least we'd be outside doing something, Danny texted. Better than being locked up like prisoners. Yeah, and it's only one weekend, I replied. How bad could it be? Looking back now, I realize that was probably the last normal conversation Danny and I would ever have. Friday after school, Dad picked both of us up in his truck, the back loaded with hunting gear and supplies. The drive to his cabin in northern Michigan took nearly 4 hours, winding through increasingly remote roads until we were surrounded by nothing but dense forest and the occasional rundown gas station. The further we drove, the more excited Dad became, humming along to classic rock on the radio and pointing out landmarks from his own childhood hunting trips. You boys are going to love this, he said for the 10th time, glancing at us in the rearview mirror. Nothing like being out in nature, away from all those computers and video games. This'll put some hair on your chest. Danny and I exchanged a look that said everything. This was going to be a long weekend. The cabin sat in a small clearing about a mile off the main road, accessible only by a rutted dirt path that made the truck bounce and groan with every pothole. It was smaller than I'd expected, just 2 rooms and a loft, built from logs that had darkened with age and weather. The interior smelled like pine needles, old coffee, and something else. Something earthy and organic that I couldn't quite identify. Dad spent the first hour giving us a comprehensive tour of his hunting equipment, laying everything out on the small kitchen table like a military inspection. Rifles, ammunition, hunting knives with worn leather handles, camouflage clothing that smelled like mothballs, bright orange safety vests, compasses, and first aid supplies. Each item came with a detailed explanation of its purpose and a stern lecture about safety. Rule number 1, Dad said, holding up his index finger. Never point a gun at anything unless you intend to shoot it. Rule number 2, always identify your target before you shoot. Rule number 3, stay within sight of each other at all times. These woods can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. The way he said dangerous made something cold settle in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. Dad had been hunting these woods for 20 years. If anyone knew how to stay safe out here, it was him. We heated up canned beef stew for dinner, eating by lamplight since the cabin had no electricity. The silence outside was absolute. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the occasional crack of settling wood and the distant hoot of an owl. Dad regaled us with hunting stories from his youth, his eyes bright with enthusiasm in the flickering lamplight. We'll be up at 4, he announced as we prepared for bed. Deer are most active at dawn and dusk. You'll see. There's nothing like watching the forest wake up. Danny climbed into the top bunk while I took the bottom, but neither of us could fall asleep. Every sound outside seemed amplified in the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the scratch of something small scurrying across the roof. The woods were alive with sounds I couldn't identify, and my imagination began filling in the blanks with creatures and scenarios that made my heart race. You awake? Danny whispered from above. Yeah. This place is creepy as hell. Tell me about it. What do you think is making all that noise? Probably just animals, raccoons or whatever. But even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. There was something about the sounds that seemed wrong somehow, too deliberate, too organized, like something was moving through the forest with purpose. I must have finally drifted off around midnight, because the next thing I knew, Dad was shaking me awake in what felt like the middle of the night. 4 in the morning came like a slap to the face. Dad was already dressed and making coffee and oatmeal by the light of his camping lantern, moving around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. Outside, the world was still black as pitch, with only the faintest hint of gray on the eastern horizon. Rise and shine, boys, Dad said cheerfully, as if getting up before dawn was the most natural thing in the world. Early bird gets the worm, and the early hunter gets the deer. Danny and I stumbled around in the darkness, struggling into our borrowed camouflage clothing and trying to wake up enough to function. The hunting gear felt foreign and uncomfortable. The jacket was too big, the boots too heavy, and the orange safety vest made me feel like a construction worker. Dad checked our rifles one more time, walking us through the loading and safety procedures with military precision. "Remember," he said, his voice serious in the pre-dawn darkness, "we're hunting deer, nothing else. If you see anything that isn't a deer, you don't shoot, understood?" We nodded, though I wondered what else we might encounter out here that would require such a specific warning. The hike into the woods was surreal, our flashlight beams creating small pools of light in an ocean of darkness. The air was crisp and cold, our breath visible in small puffs of vapor. Dew soaked through my boots within minutes, and I could feel the moisture seeping into my socks. Every step seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs echoing through the trees. We walked for nearly an hour, following what Dad called game trails, paths through the forest that were invisible to my untrained eyes but apparently obvious to him. The trees grew denser as we moved deeper into the woods, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out even the faint starlight. Finally, Dad stopped in a small clearing and began setting up what he called a blind, a camouflaged shelter where we could wait for deer to appear. The structure was simple but effective, providing concealment while giving us a clear view of the surrounding area. "This is where patience comes in," Dad whispered as we settled in to wait. "Hunting is 90% waiting and 10% action. The key is to stay quiet and alert." As the sun began to rise, the forest gradually came alive around us. The darkness retreated slowly, revealing details that had been hidden in the night. Trees took shape, their bark textured and varied. Undergrowth became visible, thick with ferns and fallen logs. Birds began to sing, their voices creating a natural symphony that was both beautiful and slightly unsettling. But as the morning progressed, I began to notice something odd. The birds that had been singing so enthusiastically at dawn gradually fell silent. At first, I thought it was just the natural progression of morning activities, but the silence seemed to spread through the forest like a wave, starting from somewhere deeper in the woods and moving toward us. Danny noticed it too. He kept shifting in his position, looking around nervously and opening his mouth as if to say something before Dad's stern looks reminded him to stay quiet. But even Dad seemed to sense that something had changed. His relaxed posture became more alert, and his eyes scanned the tree line with increased intensity. By 8 o'clock, we still hadn't seen any deer, and the forest had become unnaturally quiet. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like the entire woods were holding their breath. "Let's move to another spot," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. Sometimes the deer change their patterns. We packed up our minimal gear and began moving deeper into the forest, following another of Dad's invisible trails. The trees grew even denser here, their branches interlocking overhead to create a natural tunnel. Less light filtered through the canopy, and the air felt cooler, almost damp. That's when Dad suddenly stopped, his entire body going rigid. He held up his hand for silence and pointed ahead through the trees. At first I couldn't see anything unusual, just more forest, more shadows, more undergrowth. But then I noticed movement about 50 yards ahead, small shapes moving between the trees with an odd, jerky motion. Dad motioned for us to get down, and we crouched behind a fallen log. He pulled out his binoculars and studied the area for what felt like an eternity, his face growing increasingly tense. When he finally lowered the binoculars, his expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. "Tell me what you see," he whispered, handing me the binoculars. Through the binoculars, the distant figures came into sharp focus, and my blood seemed to freeze in my veins. 3 small shapes moved between the trees, no more than 3 feet tall, but they definitely weren't children. Their movements were all wrong, too stiff, too angular, like marionettes being operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with a sickly gray undertone that made them look diseased. They appeared to be naked, but their bodies were somehow wrong, proportioned in a way that hurt to look at. Their limbs were too long for their torsos, their heads too large for their necks. They moved in perfect synchronization, bending down to collect something from the forest floor before straightening up and moving to the next location. Whatever they were gathering, they placed it in small sacks or pouches that seemed to be made from some kind of organic material. The most disturbing thing was their faces. Even through the binoculars, I couldn't make out distinct features, just dark hollows where eyes should be and holes that might have been mouths. When they turned their heads, which they did frequently, the motion was too fast, too sharp, like birds of prey scanning for threats. I felt Danny nudging me urgently, and I reluctantly handed him the binoculars. His sharp intake of breath told me he was seeing the same impossible things I had witnessed. When he tried to whisper, "What the hell?" Dad immediately motioned for complete silence, his face grave with concern. I looked at my father, this man who had always been my anchor of normalcy and strength, and saw genuine fear in his eyes for the first time in my life. He'd been hunting these woods for 20 years, knew every trail and landmark, every type of wildlife that called this forest home. Whatever those things were, they weren't part of his familiar world. "What are they?" I mouthed silently. Dad shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the distant figures. He took the binoculars back and studied them for another long moment before whispering so quietly I could barely hear him. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like this." The three creatures continued their methodical collection, moving through the underbrush with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this many times before. They communicated with each other, but not with sounds. Instead, they used quick, jerky gestures that looked almost like sign language. Occasionally, one would pause and tilt its oversized head, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Danny was breathing heavily beside me, and I could see him struggling not to panic. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were shaking as he gripped his rifle. I reached over and touched his arm, trying to provide some comfort, but I was just as terrified as he was. That's when Danny made the mistake that changed everything. In his nervousness, he shifted his weight too quickly and lost his balance. His elbow caught on a protruding root, sending him tumbling backward with a crash that echoed through the silent forest like a gunshot. His rifle hit the ground with a metallic clang that seemed to reverberate forever. The effect on the three creatures was immediate and terrifying. They stopped moving instantly, their heads snapping toward our location with that same unnaturally fast motion. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel them focusing their attention on us, like the weight of their gaze was a physical force pressing against my chest. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other across the forest floor. The creatures remained perfectly still, their dark eye hollows fixed on our hiding spot. Dad's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I could see his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, all three creatures began moving toward us, not running, not rushing, but walking with that same jerky, unnatural gait. Their movements were purposeful and coordinated, like hunters who had just spotted their prey. "Run," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run now." We exploded from our hiding spot like startled deer, crashing through the underbrush without any regard for stealth or safety. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our faces as we fled deeper into the forest. Behind us, I could hear Dad shouting instructions, but his words were lost in the thunder of our panic and the sound of breaking branches. Danny stumbled again, going down hard and crying out as he hit the ground. Dad stopped to help him while I kept running, my mind blank with terror. Every shadow looked like a pursuing figure. Every movement in my peripheral vision made my heart race faster. "Keep going," Dad's voice echoed behind me. "Get back to the cabin. We'll catch up." I hesitated for just a moment, torn between loyalty to my friend and the overwhelming need to escape. But Dad's voice carried an authority I'd never heard before, a command that brooked no argument. "Go!" So I ran. The forest became a blur of green and brown as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping across my face and thorns tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned with the effort of running, and my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. Every sound behind me, every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, convinced me that those things were gaining ground. I had no idea if I was going in the right direction. The trails that Dad had followed so confidently were invisible to me, and every tree looked the same. Panic made it impossible to think clearly, to remember the landmarks we'd passed on the way in. All I could do was run and hope that instinct would guide me back to safety. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I burst through the tree line into the familiar clearing where the cabin sat. I'd never been so relieved to see that small, weathered building. My legs gave out as I reached the front door, and I collapsed against it, gasping for air and shaking uncontrollably. It took several minutes before I could steady my hands enough to work the door handle. Once inside, I immediately locked the door behind me and grabbed Dad's shotgun from the rack above the fireplace. My fingers fumbled with the shells as I tried to load it, dropping several on the floor in my haste. The simple mechanical action of loading the weapon helped calm my nerves slightly, giving my hands something to do while my mind raced. I positioned myself facing the door and window, the shotgun across my knees, and waited. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every sound outside, the whisper of wind through the trees, the creak of settling wood, the distant call of a bird, made me jump and tighten my grip on the weapon. 1 hour passed, then another. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. Where were Dad and Danny? What had happened after I ran? The possibilities that ran through my mind were too terrible to contemplate, but I couldn't stop imagining the worst. As afternoon faded into evening, I heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps that sounded human, but somehow wrong. I raised the shotgun, my finger hovering over the trigger, and held my breath. 3 knocks echoed through the small cabin. "Son, it's us," came Dad's voice through the door. "Open up." Relief flooded through me so intensely that I almost cried, but something made me hesitate. There was something about Dad's voice that didn't sound quite right. It was flatter than usual, lacking the warmth and inflection I was used to. It sounded like someone doing an impression of my father. "Dad?" I called back, not moving from my position. "Yes," came the reply. "Open the door. Danny's hurt." I moved to the window and peered out carefully. There they were, Dad and Danny standing on the small porch, looking perfectly normal. Dad was wearing the same hunting clothes he'd put on that morning, and Danny was standing upright, apparently uninjured, despite the claim that he was hurt. But something was wrong with the way they stood. Too straight, too still, like soldiers at attention. And Danny wasn't looking at the cabin. His gaze was fixed on some point in the distance, his expression blank and vacant. "What happened out there?" I called through the door, still not moving to unlock it. "We'll explain inside," Dad replied in that same flat tone. "Open the door." "Danny, are you okay?" I asked directly. Danny's head turned toward the sound of my voice, but his movement was too sharp, too quick, exactly like the motions of those creatures in the forest. When our eyes met through the window, there was no recognition in his gaze, no spark of the friendship we'd shared for 11 years. His eyes were empty, like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. But they were my father and my best friend. Whatever had happened in the woods, whatever had frightened us so badly, they were here now, and they were alive. That had to count for something. Slowly, reluctantly, I unlocked the door. Dad and Danny entered the cabin with movements that were subtly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Dad walked too stiffly, his usual casual stride replaced by something mechanical and precise. Danny moved like he was concentrating on each step, as if walking had become something that required conscious thought rather than instinct. The first thing Dad did was take the shotgun from my hands. "Don't need this now," he said, his voice carrying that same flat quality I'd noticed through the door. There was no warmth in it, no relief at our reunion. no acknowledgement of the terror we'd all experienced in the woods. Danny sat heavily on the small couch, his gaze fixed on the floor. His clothes were dirty and torn, consistent with our panicked flight through the forest, but there were no visible injuries, no cuts, no bruises, nothing to explain why Dad had claimed he was hurt. "What happened after I left?" I asked, settling into the chair across from them. "Those things in the woods, what were they?" Dad began packing our gear with methodical efficiency, folding clothes and organizing equipment as if we were checking out of a hotel. "What things?" he asked without looking up. The question hit me like a physical blow. "The creatures we saw, the small ones collecting stuff from the forest floor. We all saw them through the binoculars." "We didn't see anything," Dad replied, his voice emotionless. "There was a bear. We ran, that's all." I stared at him in disbelief. A bear? That was his explanation for what we'd witnessed? "Dad, that's not what happened. Those things weren't bears. They were—" "We're leaving now," Dad interrupted, cutting off my protests. He continued packing with the same mechanical precision, never pausing to look at me or acknowledge what I was saying. I turned to Danny, desperate for support, for someone to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. "Danny, tell him. You saw them too. You looked through the binoculars." Danny finally raised his head to meet my gaze, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach lurch. There was no recognition there, no memory of our shared experience, no acknowledgement of our lifelong friendship. When he spoke, his voice had the same flat quality as Dad's. "Your father's right," he said slowly, as if each word required effort. "It was just a bear." But even as he said it, I could see his hands trembling slightly, and there was something in his expression. Fear, maybe, or a desperate plea for me to stop asking questions. His eyes seemed to be trying to communicate something his words couldn't say. The drive home was a nightmare of silence and tension. Dad drove with the same mechanical precision he'd shown while packing, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Danny sat beside me in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Every attempt I made at conversation was met with monosyllabic responses or complete silence. When we dropped Danny off at his house, I expected some acknowledgement of our friendship, some promise to talk later about what had really happened. Instead, he got out of the truck without a word, walking toward his front door with that same stiff, unnatural gait. "Danny," I called after him through the window, "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" He paused at his front door and turned back toward me. For just a moment, his expression seemed to flicker, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been the real Danny trying to communicate. But then his face went blank again, and he nodded once before disappearing into his house. At home, Mom was waiting in the kitchen with dinner prepared and questions about our hunting trip. Dad's response was brief and emotionless. "Fine." He headed straight for the basement, and I could hear him moving around down there for hours, doing something that involved a lot of heavy lifting and what sounded like construction. That night, lying in my bed and staring at the ceiling, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my mind wanted to accept Dad's explanation. Maybe the stress and fear had made us see things that weren't there. Maybe it really had been just a bear, and our imaginations had filled in the terrifying details. But I couldn't shake the memory of those pale, wrong-shaped figures moving through the forest with such purpose. I couldn't forget the way they'd all turned toward us when Danny made noise, or the way they'd begun approaching us with that coordinated predatory movement. And I couldn't ignore the fact that both Dad and Danny had returned fundamentally changed, as if something essential had been removed from them and replaced with a hollow imitation. Danny didn't call the next day or the day after that. When I finally worked up the courage to call him, his mother answered and said he was sleeping, that he'd been very tired since the hunting trip. The third time I called, she said he wasn't feeling well and couldn't come to the phone. When I saw him at school the following Monday, it was like looking at a stranger wearing Danny's face. Danny's transformation became more apparent with each passing day at school. He moved through the hallways like he was navigating an unfamiliar maze, pausing at intersections and staring at familiar faces as if he couldn't quite remember who they were. Our shared interests, Anime, video games, the inside jokes that had sustained our friendship for years seemed to have been wiped from his memory completely. During lunch, I cornered him at his usual table in the cafeteria. "Dude, we need to talk about what happened in the woods," I said, keeping my voice low. "Something's wrong with you, and something's wrong with my dad." Danny looked at me with those empty eyes, chewing his sandwich with mechanical precision. "Nothing happened in the woods," he said in that same flat tone that had become his default mode of communication. "We saw a bear. We ran. End of story." "Stop lying," I hissed, frustration boiling over. "We've been best friends since we were 5 years old. You can't just pretend that those things we saw weren't real." For just a moment, something flickered across Danny's face, a brief crack in the facade that revealed the terror lurking beneath. His hand started to shake, and he dropped his sandwich onto the table. When he looked at me, I could see the real Danny trapped behind those vacant eyes, struggling to communicate something his mouth couldn't say. "Drop it," he whispered, glancing around the cafeteria as if he expected to see something watching us. "For your own good, just drop it." That was the last real conversation we had. Danny started avoiding me after that, taking different routes through the hallways and sitting with different people at lunch. When I tried to approach him, he would walk away without a word. It was like watching my best friend die and be replaced by a hollow shell. A month later, Danny's parents transferred him to a private school across town. They said he needed a fresh start and that the public school environment wasn't right for him anymore. I never saw him again. Things at home deteriorated just as rapidly. Dad spent increasingly long periods in the basement, sometimes disappearing down there for entire days. He installed a heavy padlock on the basement door, and when I asked him about it, he just stared at me with those wrong eyes until I looked away. The sounds from the basement became a constant source of anxiety. I could hear him talking down there, but it sounded like he was having conversations with multiple people. The voices that responded didn't sound quite human. They were too high-pitched, too sharp, like the chirping of birds, but with an underlying intelligence that made my skin crawl. Mom noticed the changes too, though she tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. "Your father's just going through something," she told me one evening as we sat at the dinner table without him. "Men his age sometimes have difficulties adjusting to changes in their lives." But I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she glanced nervously toward the basement door whenever those strange sounds drifted upstairs. She'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. Dad's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped going to work, claiming he was taking a leave of absence to focus on important research. When his boss called the house looking for him, Dad would disappear into the basement and refuse to come out until the phone stopped ringing. He began taking long walks at night, leaving the house after we'd gone to bed and returning before dawn. I started staying awake to listen for his return, and the sounds he made coming back were wrong. His footsteps were too light, too quick, and sometimes I could swear I heard other footsteps accompanying his, smaller, quicker steps that didn't sound like they belonged to human feet. In the mornings, I would find evidence of his nocturnal activities, mud tracked through the kitchen that had an odd, organic smell unlike regular dirt, and small scratches on his arms and face that he couldn't or wouldn't explain. His clothes would be filthy and sometimes torn, as if he'd been crawling through underbrush or digging in the earth. The final straw came on a cold morning in December, 3 months after our hunting trip. I woke to the sound of screaming. I found Mom on the bathroom floor, her body convulsing as some invisible force seemed to be tearing through her nervous system. Dad stood in the doorway watching, his expression utterly blank, as if he were observing a mildly interesting television program rather than his wife's medical emergency. "Call 911!" I screamed at him as I knelt beside Mom, trying to remember what I'd learned about seizures in health class. But Dad just stood there, motionless, those wrong eyes fixed on Mom's writhing form with what might have been clinical curiosity. I called 911 myself, my hand shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to Dad's eerie passivity. They worked on Mom with practiced skill, checking her vital signs and asking questions that Dad answered in monosyllables. Stroke, one of the paramedics told me as they loaded Mom onto a stretcher. Severe one. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. I expected Dad to ride in the ambulance or at least follow us to the hospital, but he simply stood in the driveway and watched as we drove away. When I looked back through the rear window, he was still standing there, perfectly still, like a statue of a man rather than a living human being. Mom spent 2 weeks in the ICU, her brain activity monitored by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence. The doctor said there had been massive damage, that even if she survived, she would likely never be the same. Dad visited exactly once, standing beside her bed for 5 minutes before leaving without a word. She died on a Tuesday morning while I was at school. Dad picked me up from the principal's office, delivered the news in that same flat tone he'd used for everything else, and drove us home in silence. At the funeral, he stood apart from everyone else, showing no emotion as they lowered Mom's casket into the ground. When people tried to offer their condolences, Dad would stare at them with those empty eyes until they became uncomfortable and walked away. Several family friends commented on how different he seemed, how the loss had changed him. If they only knew how right they were. The year and a half that followed were the worst of my life. Living alone with the thing that had replaced my father was like being trapped in a house with a barely functional robot that occasionally remembered it was supposed to pretend to be human. He rarely spoke, rarely ate, and spent almost all his time in that locked basement. Strange packages began arriving at irregular intervals, small boxes wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Dad would take them directly to the basement, and I would hear sounds down there that suggested he was opening them and distributing their contents to something. The organic smell that had always emanated from the basement grew stronger, accompanied by new odors that made me gag when they drifted upstairs. Sometimes I would find tiny footprints in the mud by the back door, footprints that were roughly human-shaped but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process them completely. They were too small to belong to an adult, but they had too many toes and the proportions were all wrong. Dad's physical transformation accelerated during this period. He lost weight rapidly, his skin taking on that same grayish, translucent quality I'd seen in the creatures in the forest. His movements became even more mechanical and precise, and sometimes I would catch him moving his head with that same sharp, bird-like motion that had terrified me in the woods. I counted down the days until my 18th birthday, with the desperate intensity of a prisoner awaiting parole. I applied to colleges as far from home as possible, eventually choosing a school in California that offered me a partial scholarship. Dad showed no interest in my plans, no emotion when I told him I was leaving. He simply nodded once and returned to whatever he was doing in the basement. On graduation day, Dad didn't attend the ceremony. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma with an empty chair where my father should have been sitting. That night, as I packed my belongings for the move to California, I could hear him in the basement having one of his conversations with those other voices. I left the next morning while he was on one of his nocturnal walks, unable to face another emotionless goodbye. I left a note on the kitchen table explaining that I was starting my new life and didn't know when I'd be back. Looking back at the house as I drove away, I realized I was probably seeing it for the last time. College was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life among people who didn't know about my strange family history. I made friends, joined clubs, and slowly began to feel human again. The nightmares came less frequently, and I started to believe that maybe I could leave the past behind. But I couldn't shake the need to know what had happened to Dad, what those things in the forest had been, and why Danny and I had been the only ones to see them. During winter break of my freshman year, I drove back to Michigan to collect the rest of my belongings and hopefully get some answers. The house looked abandoned when I pulled into the driveway. The grass was overgrown, newspapers and mail had piled up on the front porch, and several windows had been broken by storm damage that no one had bothered to repair. The neighbors said they hadn't seen Dad in months. Using my old key, I entered the house that no longer felt like home. The smell hit me immediately, that organic, earthy odor I remembered from the basement, but now it permeated the entire house. The furniture was covered in dust, and there were more of those strange footprints tracked across the floors. Dad's bedroom was completely empty. His clothes, his personal belongings, even his furniture. Everything was gone, as if he had simply evaporated. The only sign that he'd ever lived there was a thin layer of dust in the shape of a bed frame on the hardwood floor. Steeling myself for what I might find, I used the key hanging beside the basement door to unlock it for the first time. The basement was empty, too, completely empty, except for a single piece of paper lying in the center of the concrete floor. I picked up the paper with trembling hands. Written in Dad's familiar handwriting were 3 words: "They are home." Below that, in a different handwriting, smaller, more angular, like the scratching of claws on paper, was a single line: "The cycle continues." That night, staying in a motel near the highway, I called the police to report Dad missing. They filed a report, but as the detective explained, adults have the right to disappear if they want to. They'd investigate if evidence of foul play emerged, but for now it was just another missing person case in a world full of people who walked away from their lives. I sold the house through a real estate attorney, never setting foot in it again. The buyers were a young couple with 2 small children who were excited about the rustic charm of the property. I wondered if they would notice the strange smells, the odd sounds that came from the basement, the footprints that appeared in the mud after certain kinds of rain. I never returned to my hometown after that, but sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself searching online for missing person reports from that area of Michigan. There have been several over the years, people who went into those woods and never came out, or who came out changed in ways their families couldn't explain. And sometimes, when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment in California, I can swear I hear the sound of small, quick footsteps moving through the darkness, accompanied by voices that are too high-pitched to be human, but too intelligent to be animal. The hunting trip was supposed to make men out of Danny and me. Instead, it showed us that there are things in this world that are better left undiscovered. Creatures that exist in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're capable of understanding. I'm 26 now, graduated from college, working a normal job, living a normal life. But every hunting season, when the leaves begin to turn and the air grows cold, I remember those pale figures moving through the forest with their jerky, purposeful gait. I remember Dad's empty eyes and Danny's terrified silence. And I wonder if somewhere in those Michigan woods, they're still out there, still collecting whatever it was they gathered from the forest floor, still waiting for the next group of hunters to stumble into their territory. The cycle continues, just like the note said. Some nights, when the dreams are particularly vivid, I wake up with the taste of pine needles in my mouth and the smell of that organic, earthy odor filling my nostrils. On those nights, I check all the locks on my doors and windows, and I remind myself that I'm hundreds of miles away from those woods. But I know, deep in my bones, that distance doesn't matter to creatures like that. They're patient. They're organized, and they remember everyone who has seen them. The hunting trip taught me that there are predators in this world far more dangerous than bears or wolves. The real predators walk upright, speak in whispers, and know how to wear the faces of the people we love. And once they've noticed you, once you've stumbled into their territory and witnessed their work, you become part of their collection. Maybe not right away, maybe not for years, but eventually, everyone comes home. The Granite Peak Trail was supposed to be a challenge, not a nightmare. My friend Darren had suggested the trip, a 5-day trek through one of the most remote sections of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. As an experienced hiker with over a decade of backcountry trips under my belt, I didn't think twice about accepting. Our group consisted of 4 people: myself, Darren, his cousin Josh, and Josh's girlfriend Melanie. We'd all hiked together before, though never on something this isolated. The Bitterroots have nearly 1.6 million acres of wilderness, and the northern section we'd chosen sees fewer than 50 hikers a year. Perfect spot to disappear if you wanted to, Josh had joked as we finalized our route. I remember laughing. We arrived at the trailhead on a Wednesday morning in early October. The parking area was empty except for our vehicle, a beaten-up Subaru Outback that had seen better days. "Nobody else crazy enough to be out here this late in the season," Darren remarked, shouldering his pack. The temperature was forecasted to drop below freezing at night, but we were prepared with proper gear. The first signs of something off came within hours of starting our hike. About 3 miles in, we found unusual markings on several trees, not standard trail blazes, but deep parallel gouges about 6 feet up the trunks. They appeared too methodical to be from animal claws. "Bear marking territory?" Melanie suggested, examining one of the cuts. "Bears don't mark this high," I replied, "and not in straight lines like this." "Probably some local hunters," Darren said dismissively. "They use weird markers sometimes." We pressed on, making good time despite our heavy packs. By late afternoon, we'd covered 8 miles of steady incline, working our way deeper into the forest. The trail grew progressively narrower, with fewer signs of human passage. Pine needles crunched beneath our boots, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of decomposing leaves and damp earth. Our planned campsite was near a small mountain stream, according to our topographic maps. We reached it just before sunset, a small clearing surrounded by dense pines and firs, with the gentle sound of running water nearby. As we set up our tents, I noticed Josh studying the tree line with an unusual intensity. "What's up?" I asked. "Nothing," he said, still staring. "Just thought I saw something move out there." "Probably deer," I said. "They're curious creatures." "Yeah, probably." We gathered firewood and prepared dinner as darkness fell. The temperature dropped rapidly, and we huddled around the fire, swapping stories and passing a flask of whiskey. The forest around us came alive with night sounds, the rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then abruptly, everything went silent. The transition was so sudden that all 4 of us noticed at once, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. The forest had become completely still, as if holding its breath. Even the stream seemed to quiet. "That's weird," Melanie whispered, her voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "Probably a predator nearby," Darren said, though he didn't sound convinced. "When smaller animals sense a threat, they go quiet." We listened intently for several minutes, but heard nothing beyond the soft crackling of our fire. Eventually, the normal forest sounds gradually returned, but they seemed different somehow, more cautious, more restrained. That night, I awoke to the sound of movement outside my tent. Not the familiar rustling of nocturnal forest creatures, but deliberate bipedal steps circling our campsite. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The footsteps paused near my tent, and I could swear I heard breathing, deep, rhythmic, but not quite human. I reached for my flashlight, debating whether to investigate, when Darren's voice came from the neighboring tent. "Hello? Is someone out there?" The footsteps retreated rapidly into the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" I whispered across to Darren's tent. "Yeah," he replied. "Sounded like someone walking around." "I'm going to check it out," I said, unzipping my tent. The campsite was bathed in moonlight. Nothing moved in the surrounding trees. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Our backpacks, which we'd hung from a tree branch to keep away from animals, had been taken down. They now sat nearly arranged by our fire pit, the contents undisturbed but clearly examined. "Wake the others," I told Darren, who had emerged from his tent. "Someone's been through our stuff." Josh and Melanie joined us, and we surveyed the scene with growing unease. "Should we pack up and head back?" Melanie asked, hugging herself against the cold. "In the middle of the night?" Josh shook his head. "That's asking to get lost or injured." "We stick together until morning," I decided. 2-person watches until dawn. Then we decide. None of us slept much after that. During my watch with Darren, I spotted movement at the edge of our camp, just a shadow slipping between trees, there and gone so quickly, I couldn't be certain I'd seen anything at all. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" Darren replied, scanning the darkness. I hesitated. "Nothing. Just my eyes playing tricks." But I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was watching us, and whatever it was getting bolder. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the forest floor. We debated returning to the trailhead, but ultimately decided to continue our planned route. The incident with our backpacks was concerning, but we rationalized it might have been caused by an unusually bold animal, perhaps a raccoon or even a black bear. Let's just be more careful about securing our food and gear, Josh suggested. We broke camp efficiently, each of us eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had visited during the night. The day's hike would take us deeper into the wilderness, following the ridgeline up toward Granite Peak. According to our map, we'd make camp near an alpine lake about 9 miles ahead. The forest changed as we ascended. The thick pines gave way to sparser vegetation, and occasional clearings offered breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. By noon, we'd climbed nearly 2,000 feet in elevation. During a water break, I noticed something unusual about half a mile down the slope, a flash of unnatural color among the browns and greens of the forest. "Does anyone else see that?" I asked, pointing. Darren pulled out his binoculars and focused. "Looks like fabric? Maybe a tent or backpack?" "Another hiker?" Melanie suggested hopefully. "Let's check it out," I said. "It's not far off our path." We descended carefully through the underbrush. As we got closer, I could see it was indeed a tent, or what remained of one. The once blue fabric was shredded and scattered across a small clearing, along with the contents of a backpack. Clothing, a water filter, packages of freeze-dried food torn open and strewn about. "Jesus," Josh whispered, surveying the scene. "Bear attack?" I examined the damage more closely. "I don't think so. These tears are too clean, too deliberate." "Could be a mountain lion," Darren suggested, but he sounded doubtful. "Where's the hiker?" Melanie asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. We searched the area, calling out and listening for a response. About 30 yards from the destroyed campsite, we found a hiking boot, still laced, lying on its side. "This isn't good," I said, picking it up. The boot was a men's size 11, sturdy and well-worn. There was no blood or signs of struggle, just a single boot abandoned in the woods. "We need to go back and report this," Melanie insisted, her voice tight with fear. "That would take us a day and a half," Josh countered. "And we don't even know what happened here. Maybe the guy just had an equipment failure and hiked out on his own." "Leaving his boot behind?" I asked skeptically. "Look," Darren said, "we should at least check the registration log at the next ranger station. It's only about 5 miles ahead, and we can decide what to do from there." We agreed on this compromise, but the discovery had cast a pall over our expedition. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Several times I spun around, certain I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, but saw nothing. About 2 miles from the destroyed campsite, Josh stopped abruptly. "Tracks," he said, pointing to the ground. The path here was muddy from a recent rainfall, and clear impressions were visible in the soft earth. They weren't human footprints, nor did they match any animal I recognized. The tracks were large, about the size of a human hand, with unusual elongated toes and what looked like claw marks at the tips. "What the hell made these?" Melanie asked, crouching down. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some kind of predator, but nothing native to these mountains that I'm aware of." "They're following the trail," Darren observed. "Same direction we're heading." "Could be a wolf with an injured paw," Josh suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. The tracks continued for nearly a quarter mile before disappearing where the trail became rocky. We proceeded with heightened caution, frequently checking behind us and keeping closer together than before. By late afternoon, we reached the small ranger station marked on our map, a simple log cabin used primarily during fire season. As expected in October, it was unmanned and locked. A logbook protected in a plastic case was mounted beside the door for hikers to register their presence in the backcountry. Darren flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. Last sign-in was 10 days ago. Party of 2, names are Miller and Petrosky. Planned a 7-day loop through this area. "That could be whose tent we found," I said. "They never signed out?" Darren noted grimly. We debated our options as the sun began to sink toward the mountain peaks. Turning back would mean at least another day of hiking, and darkness was approaching rapidly. The alpine lake where we'd planned to camp was less than 2 miles ahead. Let's stick to the plan, I decided finally. We'll reach the lake before dark, make camp, and head back first thing tomorrow. No one was enthusiastic about continuing forward, but the alternative, being caught on the trail after nightfall, seemed worse. We moved at a brisk pace, eager to reach our destination before losing daylight completely. The lake appeared just as the sun touched the horizon, a small, pristine body of water nestled in a natural bowl formed by surrounding ridges. In different circumstances, it would have been idyllic. Now, with the knowledge of the destroyed campsite and strange tracks, it felt exposed and vulnerable. We set up camp with military efficiency, positioning our tents close together and gathering extra firewood. No one spoke about what we'd found, but it hung in the air between us, an unacknowledged presence as tangible as the approaching darkness. That night, as we sat around the fire, Melanie broke the uneasy silence. I keep feeling like we're being watched. None of us contradicted her. I'd felt the same sensation all afternoon, eyes following our movements, calculating, waiting. The feeling was so intense I could almost point to where the observer was hiding. We should set up a perimeter, I suggested, something that will make noise if anything approaches. Using fishing line from Josh's emergency kit, we strung an alarm system around our campsite, cans and metal cooking equipment that would rattle if the line was disturbed. It wasn't much, but it provided some small comfort as we retired to our tents. Sleep was elusive that night. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, the rustle of pine needles, the soft lapping of water against the lakeshore, the occasional distant cry of a nightbird. I lay awake, listening, waiting, my hand resting on the handle of my hunting knife. Just before midnight, our alarm system erupted in a cacophony of metallic clanging. I bolted upright in my tent, fumbling for my flashlight. Outside, the alarm continued to sound, a chaotic jangling of displaced cookware. Darren was already shouting, his voice tight with fear. "Who's there? We're armed." A bluff, but perhaps a necessary one. Between us, we had only hunting knives and a small hatchet for splitting firewood. I unzipped my tent with one hand, knife clutched in the other, and emerged into the moonlit clearing. The perimeter line on the western edge of our camp had been triggered. Metal cups and plates lay scattered on the ground, but there was no sign of what had disturbed them. The others joined me, forming a tight cluster, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "Did anyone see anything?" I asked. "Movement by those trees," Josh said, pointing toward a dense stand of pines about 30 yards away. "Just for a second." We swept our lights across the area but illuminated nothing except foliage and shadows. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet again, the same eerie silence we'd experienced the previous night. "Let's build up the fire," I suggested. The idea of light and warmth seemed comforting, even if it was mostly psychological. As we gathered around the rekindled flames, Melanie gripped Josh's arm suddenly. "Listen," she whispered. At first, I heard nothing. Then it came, a sound so incongruous it took several seconds to process. Someone or something was whistling, a simple 3-note pattern repeated at irregular intervals. The sound seemed to move, circling our campsite just beyond the reach of our firelight. "Hello?" Darren called out. "Is someone there? We're friendly hikers." The whistling stopped immediately. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the crackling of our fire. Then came a response, not words, but a perfect mimicry of Darren's voice repeating his exact inflection. "Hello? Is someone there? We're friendly hikers." The imitation was so precise it seemed impossible, like hearing a recording played back. Goosebumps erupted across my arms. "What the hell?" Josh muttered. The voice came again, this time mimicking Josh. "What the hell?" "It's playing with us," I said quietly. As if in confirmation, my own words echoed back from the darkness. "It's playing with us." We stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this bizarre encounter. The mimic fell silent for several minutes, long enough that we began to wonder if it had departed. Then a new sound emerged from the forest. Not mimicry this time, but a low, rhythmic clicking noise like stones being struck together. "We need to leave," Melanie said, her voice barely audible. "First light, we pack up and go." None of us argued with this plan. The clicking continued throughout the night, sometimes moving closer, sometimes receding, but never completely disappearing. We maintained a vigil in shifts, keeping the fire burning high, no one managing more than brief, fitful sleep. The pre-dawn light brought no relief. A dense fog had settled over the lake, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. The clicking had stopped, but the sense of being observed remained palpable. We packed quickly, leaving behind non-essential items to speed our departure. The plan was simple: retrace our steps to the ranger station, then follow the main trail back to the trailhead. If we pushed hard, we could make it out before nightfall. The fog complicated our journey. Landmarks visible just yesterday had vanished in the murky grayness, forcing us to rely on compass readings and trail markers. We moved as quickly as safety allowed, no one speaking except to confirm directions or warn of obstacles. About a mile from camp, Melanie stopped abruptly. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the ground. The trail here was soft, and clear impressions were visible in the dirt, the same unusual tracks we'd seen the day before, but now they were everywhere, crisscrossing the path as if whatever made them had been pacing back and forth. The tracks were fresh, the edges still crisp. "It was here during the night," I said, "watching us." "Let's keep moving," Darren urged, glancing nervously at the surrounding forest, now ghostly and indistinct in the fog. We quickened our pace, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fear. The strange tracks followed the trail for nearly half a mile before veering off into the underbrush. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, certain that our stalker was keeping pace just out of sight. The fog began to thin as the morning progressed, but our sense of unease only intensified. The forest seemed different somehow, the familiar sounds absent or altered, the spacing of trees not quite as I remembered. Several times Josh consulted the map with growing confusion. "This doesn't look right," he said finally, stopping at a fork in the trail not marked on our map. "We should have reached the ranger station by now." "We must have taken a wrong turn," Darren suggested, though we'd been following the main trail consistently. "Or the fog disoriented us," I added, trying to make sense of our surroundings. We decided to take the right fork, which seemed to angle back toward where we believed the ranger station should be. The path narrowed quickly, becoming less maintained, with branches reaching across the trail and roots creating treacherous obstacles. After another hour of increasingly difficult hiking, the trail disappeared entirely, leaving us standing in a small clearing surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. The realization hit us simultaneously. We were lost. "This is impossible," Josh said, frustration evident in his voice. "We followed the main trail. There's no way we should be this disoriented." "Let's check the compass again," I suggested, trying to remain calm. Darren pulled out his compass and frowned. "This can't be right. According to this, we've been heading northeast, but we should have been going southwest toward the trailhead." "Let me see," I said, taking the compass. The needle spun lazily, never settling on any particular direction. "It's malfunctioning." "Mine too," Melanie said, checking her own compass. "How is that possible?" "Natural magnetic deposits in the area, maybe," Josh suggested, but he sounded doubtful. We had no choice but to use the sun for orientation, but even this proved challenging with the lingering fog and the dense forest canopy obscuring clear sight lines. We selected what seemed to be the most promising direction and began hiking, marking trees as we passed to avoid going in circles. The day wore on and our progress seemed painfully slow. The terrain became increasingly difficult. Steep inclines, rocky outcroppings, dense underbrush that snagged at our clothing and equipment. By mid-afternoon, we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. "We need to stop and regroup," I said finally. We're burning energy and not making meaningful progress. We found a small clearing and dropped our packs, grateful for the respite. As we shared water and trail mix, I noticed Melanie staring intently into the forest. "Do you hear that?" she asked. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then it registered. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from deeper in the woods, the same clicking we'd heard during the night. "It's still following us," Josh muttered. "Maybe it's trying to communicate," Darren suggested, though his expression betrayed his doubt. "Or it's hunting us," I said quietly. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, coming from multiple directions now. It was as if we were surrounded, the sound closing in from all sides. We gathered our gear quickly, abandoning the rest break. "Stay together," I urged as we moved off, choosing the direction with the least audible clicking. The sounds followed us throughout the afternoon, sometimes receding, sometimes approaching so close I was certain we'd come face to face with whatever was making them. The forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead, promising rain and an early dusk. With daylight fading and no sign of the trail, we were forced to make camp in another small clearing. Unlike our previous sites, this one offered little natural protection. No lake or rock formations to guard our backs, just trees in every direction. As we set up our tents with grim efficiency, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were exactly where something wanted us to be. The rain started just after sunset, a gentle patter at first, quickly intensifying to a steady downpour that drummed against our tent flies and saturated the ground. We huddled beneath our inadequate shelter, the planned campfire impossible in the deluge. Our headlamps created small islands of light in the overwhelming darkness. The temperature dropped rapidly, and soon we were shivering despite our layers of clothing. The clicking sounds had stopped when the rain began, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. "We can't stay out here another night," Melanie said, her voice barely audible over the rainfall. "We need to find our way back to civilization tomorrow, no matter what." "Agreed," I said. "First light, we pick a direction and stick with it. Eventually we'll hit a road or a town." "We should be taking shifts keeping watch," Josh suggested. Darren nodded. "I'll take first watch." We established a rotation, 2 hours per person, using our watches to track time. I was scheduled for the final shift just before dawn. Exhausted from the day's arduous hiking, I fell into a restless sleep almost immediately, my dreams filled with shadowy pursuers and endless forests. When Josh woke me from my watch, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The forest was draped in fog again, limiting visibility to just a few yards beyond our campsite. I positioned myself at the edge of our cluster of tents, straining to see or hear anything unusual in the pre-dawn gloom. For the first hour, the forest remained quiet except for the occasional drip of water from saturated branches. Then, just as the eastern sky began to lighten imperceptibly, I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustling approaching from my left. I switched on my headlamp, directing the beam toward the sound. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of movement, something low to the ground, moving with unnatural speed between the trees. Then it was gone. I stood up, scanning the perimeter of our camp. The fog seemed to shift and swirl, creating illusions of movement everywhere I looked. A branch snapped behind me and I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing visible, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, not just observed, but studied, evaluated. I considered waking the others but hesitated. What would I tell them? That I'd seen a shadow? That I felt eyes on me? The decision was made for me when a blood-curdling scream tore through the forest. Not animal, not human, but something in between. The others bolted from their tents, disoriented and alarmed. "What was that?" Darren demanded, fumbling with his headlamp. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's close." We formed a tight circle, backs together, scanning the surrounding fog. For several minutes nothing happened. Then the scream came again, closer this time, followed by the now familiar clicking sound, rapid and excited. "There!" Josh shouted, pointing. Through a gap in the fog, about 30 yards away, stood a figure. In the poor visibility and strange light, details were difficult to discern, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed oddly jointed. It remained motionless, just watching us. "Hello?" Darren called out, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" The figure tilted its head, an unsettlingly bird-like motion, but didn't respond or move closer. "We're lost hikers," I added, trying to sound calm. "We don't mean any harm." For a long moment the standoff continued. 4 terrified hikers and the silent, unmoving watcher. Then, without warning, it dropped to all fours and vanished into the fog with startling speed. "What the hell was that?" Josh whispered, his face pale in the beam of my headlamp. "A person," Melanie insisted. "It had to be a person." "That wasn't human," Darren countered. "Did you see how it moved?" "It doesn't matter what it was," I interrupted. "We need to leave. Now." Despite the early hour and limited visibility, we packed up immediately, abandoning any equipment that would slow us down. Our priority was distance, putting as much space as possible between ourselves and whatever was stalking us. We chose a direction based solely on the rising sun and started hiking, pushing through wet underbrush and slippery terrain. No one spoke. We saved our breath for movement, for escape. About an hour into our frantic journey, Melanie stopped suddenly. "Listen," she said. We paused, hearing what had caught her attention. The distant sound of running water, much larger than a stream, a river. "Rivers lead to civilization," I said, hope flaring for the first time in days. "If we follow it downstream, we'll eventually reach a road or a town." We altered course toward the sound, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The terrain grew steeper as we descended toward the river valley, forcing us to use trees and rocks for support. The fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of our surroundings, unfamiliar territory, but at least we could see more than a few yards ahead. When we finally reached the river, it was larger than expected, about 30 feet across with a strong current. The banks were rocky and steep, making travel alongside it challenging but not impossible. "Downstream," I confirmed, pointing to our right. "That should eventually lead us out of the wilderness." We had covered perhaps half a mile along the riverbank when Darren, who was leading, stopped abruptly. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the ground. Pressed into a patch of mud were several distinct footprints, human footprints, from hiking boots. They were recent, the edges still sharp despite the rain. "Other hikers?" Melanie asked hopefully. I examined the tracks more closely and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp weather. "These are our own boot prints," I said quietly, "from our original hike-in." "That's impossible," Josh protested. "We're nowhere near our original trail." But there was no denying the evidence. Somehow, despite hiking in what we thought was a completely different direction, we had circled back to a point on our inbound journey. "We've been going in circles," Darren said, his voice hollow. "This whole time." The realization was devastating. Despite our best efforts, we had made no progress toward safety. Something was interfering with our navigation, keeping us trapped in this section of wilderness. "It's playing with us," Melanie whispered, echoing my words from the previous night. As if in response, the clicking sound started again, still distant but clearly audible over the rush of the river. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, surrounding us. "We follow the river," I decided firmly. "It has to lead somewhere, and it's our best chance of breaking whatever pattern we've been caught in." No one argued. We resumed our journey downstream, moving with renewed determination. The terrain alongside the river was treacherous. Slippery rocks, steep embankments, fallen trees creating obstacles. Several times one of us nearly fell into the swift current. The clicking followed us, sometimes fading, sometimes intensifying, but never disappearing completely. We began to notice other signs of pursuit as well. Branches moving against the wind, glimpses of something dark flitting between trees on the opposite bank, occasional screams that seemed to answer the clicking sounds. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion was taking its toll. We were all stumbling more frequently, reactions slowed by fatigue and stress. We needed to rest, but stopping felt dangerous, as if movement was our only protection. "We can't keep this pace," Josh said finally, breathing heavily after a particularly steep section. "We need to eat and rehydrate or we'll make mistakes." Reluctantly, we agreed to a brief stop. Finding a relatively flat area beside the river, we collapsed onto the rocky ground, muscles aching. I distributed the remaining trail mix and energy bars, rationing carefully. Our food supplies were dwindling faster than planned. As we ate in silence, I noticed Darren staring intently across the river. "What is it?" I asked. "There's something on the other side," he said quietly. "In those trees." I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught my eye, a dark shape shifting position behind a large pine. It was difficult to discern details at this distance, but its proportions seemed similar to the figure we'd glimpsed at dawn, unnaturally tall and thin. "It's watching us again," I confirmed, keeping my voice low. "I'm getting a picture," Josh said, slowly reaching for his phone. "Don't," Melanie hissed. "It might provoke it." "We need evidence of what's happening," Josh insisted. "No one will believe us otherwise." Before anyone could stop him, he raised his phone and snapped several photos of the area across the river. The clicking sound immediately intensified, becoming angry, agitated. The figure stepped out from behind the tree. Even at this distance, there was something profoundly wrong about its appearance. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs too long and oddly articulated. Its skin, if it was skin, appeared dark and textured, blending with the forest behind it. The head was the worst part, elongated and angular, with features I couldn't quite process, as if my mind refused to register what my eyes were seeing. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at us. "Run," I whispered. We abandoned our gear, scrambling to our feet and bolting downstream. Behind us, the creature unleashed another of those terrible screams, now clearly identifiable as a hunting cry. The sound was answered by more clicking, coming from the forest on our side of the river. "They're on both sides," Darren shouted as we ran. The realization hit me with horrible clarity. We weren't being stalked by a single entity, but by multiple creatures, working in coordination to hurt us exactly where they wanted us to go. As we fled downstream, I caught glimpses of movement paralleling our course on both sides of the river, dark figures flitting between trees, always keeping pace, never falling behind despite our desperate speed. We were being hunted, and our hunters were playing with us. The chase continued until dusk, the creatures herding us downstream with calculated precision. Whenever we tried to veer away from the river, the clicking intensified, and dark shapes would appear ahead, forcing us back toward the water. By the time darkness fell, we were beyond exhaustion, muscles burning, lungs heaving, minds clouded with fatigue and terror. We had no choice but to stop, our bodies simply incapable of further flight. "We need shelter," I gasped, scanning our surroundings in the failing light. About 50 yards from the river, a rocky outcropping created a shallow overhang, not a cave, but better than completely exposed ground. We staggered toward it, collapsing beneath its meager protection. "What do they want?" Melanie whispered, her voice raw. No one answered. We had no water, no food, having abandoned our packs during our panicked flight. All that remained were the clothes on our backs and whatever was in our pockets. Josh's phone, now dead, my hunting knife, a lighter, a small first aid kit Darren had been carrying. The temperature dropped rapidly with nightfall. Huddled together for warmth, we took stock of our situation. "They could have caught us if they wanted to," Darren observed. "They're faster, they know the terrain better." "They're toying with us," Josh said bitterly. "Or hurting us," I suggested. "Notice how they keep pushing us downstream? They want us somewhere specific." This realization did nothing to comfort us. What destination could these creatures have in mind, and what would happen when we reached it? As full darkness enveloped the forest, the clicking sounds changed pattern, slower, more deliberate, like a language we couldn't comprehend. The sounds came from multiple directions, suggesting at least 3 or 4 creatures surrounding our position. "We need a fire," I decided, gathering what dry material I could find beneath the overhang. Using Darren's lighter, we managed to start a small blaze. The flames provided minimal warmth, but considerable psychological comfort. The clicking sounds retreated slightly at the appearance of fire, suggesting the creatures had at least some aversion to light. We maintained a watch rotation through the night, though sleep was nearly impossible given our circumstances. During my shift, I noticed a pattern in the creatures' movements. They would approach to a certain distance, retreat, circle, approach again, like they were testing boundaries. Once I caught a clear glimpse of one as it moved from one tree to another about 20 yards from our shelter. The firelight illuminated it briefly, the impossibly elongated limbs, the dark textured skin, the angular head. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its awkward proportions, more like an insect than a mammal. When dawn finally broke, we were still alive, but in deteriorating condition. Dehydration had set in, making our thinking sluggish and our movements uncoordinated. We needed water, which meant approaching the river, exactly where the creatures seemed to want us. "We don't have a choice," I said, when Josh questioned the wisdom of leaving our shelter. "We'll die of thirst otherwise." With extreme caution, we made our way back to the river. The clicking had stopped with daylight, and we saw no sign of our pursuers, though the sense of being watched remained. At the riverbank, we drank deeply despite concerns about water quality. The cold liquid revived us somewhat, clearing our minds enough to formulate a rudimentary plan. The river has to lead somewhere, I reasoned. Civilization, or at least a road. We keep following it downstream, but we stay vigilant. They seem less active during daylight. "And if they come for us again?" Melanie asked. I pulled out my hunting knife. "We fight if we have to." It was a hollow assertion. What could a single knife do against multiple creatures that moved with such speed and coordination? But having any plan, however desperate, was better than the paralysis of complete hopelessness. We followed the river throughout the morning, our pace slower now due to fatigue and injury. Josh had twisted his ankle during yesterday's flight, and Melanie's hands were bleeding from falls onto rocky terrain. Darren had developed a hacking cough that grew worse with exertion. The river valley gradually widened as we progressed, the current slowing and the water deepening. By midday, we estimated we'd covered perhaps 5 miles from our night shelter. The terrain was changing subtly, more deciduous trees mixed with the conifers, suggesting a lower elevation. "Look," Darren said suddenly, pointing ahead. "A bridge." About half a mile downstream, a wooden structure spanned the river, clearly man-made, though crude and weathered. The sight of it sparked renewed energy, and we quickened our pace despite our exhaustion. As we approached, the bridge revealed itself to be old but solid. Constructed from rough-hewn logs with a simple plank walkway, it appeared to connect trails on both sides of the river. "This has to lead somewhere," Josh said, hope evident in his voice for the first time in days. We stepped onto the bridge cautiously, testing its strength. The wooden planks creaked but held firm. Midway across, I stopped to examine markings carved into one of the support posts. Symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning. "Some kind of trail markers?" Darren suggested, studying the carvings. "I don't think so," I replied uneasily. "These don't look like anything official." We continued across and found ourselves at a junction of crude trails. One path followed the river downstream, while another headed directly into the forest, away from the water. "Which way?" Melanie asked. Before anyone could answer, the clicking started again, but different this time, more urgent, almost angry. It came from directly ahead, blocking the river path. "They don't want us going that way," I observed. "All the more reason to choose it," Josh argued. "Or it's a trap," Darren countered. "Maybe they're trying to make us think we should avoid that direction." The psychological games were wearing us down. Every decision felt potentially fatal, with unseen watchers analyzing our choices, staying one step ahead. In the end, we chose the forest path, reasoning that the clicking warnings felt too obvious a manipulation. The trail was more defined than expected, suggesting regular use, though by what or whom was unclear. As we moved deeper into the forest, the canopy thickened overhead, creating a perpetual twilight despite the midday hour. The clicking followed at a distance, sometimes fading completely before resuming from a different direction. After about 2 miles of steady hiking, the trail opened into a clearing. In the center stood a cabin, small, weathered, but undeniably human-built. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating occupation. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, suddenly cautious. After days of wilderness and inhuman pursuers, the sight of a habitation should have been welcome. Instead, it filled me with inexplicable dread. "Something's wrong," I whispered. "It's shelter," Josh countered. "Maybe whoever lives there can help us." "They live out here," Darren said slowly. "In the territory of those things. How is that possible?" Before we could debate further, the cabin door swung open. An elderly man emerged, dressed in worn outdoor clothing. He appeared entirely ordinary, white-bearded, slightly stooped with age, face weathered from exposure. He looked directly at us, showing no surprise at finding 4 bedraggled hikers at the edge of his clearing. "Been expecting you," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the open space. "Come on in before dark falls. Not safe out there after sunset." We exchanged glances, torn between suspicion and desperate need for shelter and assistance. "How did you know we were coming?" I called back. The old man smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "The woods have a way of sending people my direction when they need help. Come in. I've got food and water, and you look like you could use both." Against my better judgment, we approached the cabin. As we crossed the clearing, I noticed small bundles hanging from the surrounding trees. Collections of bones, feathers, and unidentifiable objects tied with sinew and twine. The old man saw me looking. "Protection," he said simply. "Been out here 40 years. You learn ways to stay safe." Inside, the cabin was a single room with sparse furnishings, a wood stove, a rough table with chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, shelves lined with jars and books. Animal pelts hung from the walls, alongside tools and weapons. "Sit," the man instructed, gesturing to the table. "Name's Hansen. Used to be Forest Service back when they staffed the stations year-round. Decided to stay on when they pulled out." He ladled stew from a pot on the stove into wooden bowls, placing them before us with chunks of hard bread. Despite my misgivings, the smell was irresistible after days of inadequate nutrition. As we ate, Hansen asked no questions about our journey or what we'd encountered. Instead, he spoke of the forest, of weather patterns and animal migrations, of the changing seasons and the isolation of wilderness living. Only when we'd finished eating did he address what had brought us to his cabin. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked, his tone matter-of-fact. "The Watchers." We exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. "It's all right," he continued. "Everyone who finds my cabin has seen them. That's how it works." "What are they?" Josh asked, breaking our silence. Hansen shrugged. "Got different names in different cultures. Navajo called them skinwalkers. Other tribes have their own terms. Scientists who come through looking for them never find anything, of course. They only show themselves to who they choose." "Why are they hunting us?" Melanie asked, her voice trembling. "Hunting?" Hansen laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "If they were hunting you, you wouldn't be sitting at my table. No, they're testing you. Like they tested me 40 years ago." "Testing for what?" I demanded. Hansen's eyes met mine, and for a moment, something flickered behind them. Something ancient and calculating that didn't match his appearance. "Worthiness," he said simply. "The forest has its guardians. They decide who belongs and who doesn't." As darkness fell outside, the clicking sounds resumed, closer now, surrounding the cabin. Hansen seemed unconcerned, adding wood to the stove and lighting oil lamps as night descended. "You'll stay until morning," he said. It wasn't an offer, but a statement of fact. "I'll show you the way out at first light. There's a logging road about 5 miles east. It'll take you back to civilization." Despite our exhaustion, none of us slept soundly that night. We took turns resting on the floor, wrapped in blankets Hansen provided. The clicking continued outside, sometimes approaching the very walls of the cabin, sometimes retreating into the forest. During my watch, I noticed Hansen wasn't sleeping either. He sat by the stove, whittling a piece of wood with practiced movements, occasionally glancing toward the windows. "How do you live out here with them?" I asked quietly, not wanting to wake the others. He considered the question for a moment. "We have an understanding," he replied finally. "I respect their territory. They respect mine. The talismans help." He nodded toward the bone bundles visible through the window, swaying gently in the night breeze. What do they want? I pressed. Hanson's hand stilled, the knife resting against the wood. Balance, he said. The forest maintains its own equilibrium. Too many outsiders disturb that balance. The missing hikers, I said. The destroyed campsite we found. Was that them? Sometimes they warn, Hanson replied obliquely. Sometimes they call. Depends on the trespass. The conversation left me more unsettled than before. Hanson's casual acceptance of the creature's actions, his talk of culling and trespass, suggested a perspective that had shifted far from normal human morality. I wondered, not for the first time, what exactly we were sharing this cabin with. Morning arrived with a heavy mist shrouding the forest. Hanson was already awake, preparing a simple breakfast of oatmeal and strong coffee. We ate quickly, eager to begin our journey to the promised logging road. Follow the sun, Hanson instructed as we prepared to leave. Keep it on your right shoulder until midday, then directly behind you. Don't deviate, no matter what you hear or see. They'll let us go? Darren asked skeptically. Hanson's expression was unreadable. You made it to my cabin. That means something to them. But don't test their patience. Move quickly and directly. Before we departed, he handed me a small bundle similar to those hanging from the trees. Carry this, he said. It won't guarantee safe passage, but it helps mark you as acknowledged. The object felt unnaturally heavy for its size, wrapped in leather with feathers and small bones protruding from the binding. I secured it to my belt with reluctance, distrusting Hanson almost as much as the creatures, but unwilling to reject any potential protection. As we set out, Hanson remained on his porch, watching our departure with those strange, evaluating eyes. Something about his gaze made me quicken my pace, eager to put distance between ourselves and the cabin. The forest seemed different that morning, the mist creating ghostly shapes among the trees, familiar sounds muted and distorted. We moved in tight formation, following Hanson's directions, the sun a pale disk barely visible through the fog and canopy. For the first hour, we heard nothing unusual, no clicking, no screams, no signs of pursuit. Gradually, our pace increased, confidence building with each unchallenged step. Maybe we're actually going to make it, Josh said cautiously, breaking the tense silence. Don't jinx it, Melanie muttered. We continued eastward, the terrain gradually descending. The forest composition changed, with more deciduous trees appearing among the conifers, suggesting we were approaching lower elevations. According to Hanson, the logging road should be accessible within a few hours of hiking. Around midday, we paused briefly to rest and reorient. The sun had strengthened, burning through patches of mist, making navigation easier. I checked the bundle Hanson had given me, still secured to my belt, though I couldn't shake the sensation that it had grown warmer, almost pulsing against my hip. As we prepared to resume our journey, Darren froze suddenly. Listen, he whispered. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then it registered, the absence of sound. The forest had gone silent again, that unnatural quiet that had preceded each encounter with the creatures. Keep moving, I urged, fighting rising panic. Hanson said don't stop no matter what. We quickened our pace, no longer trying to move quietly. Speed was our priority now, distance our only defense. The silence followed us, creating a bubble of emptiness that moved with our progress. After another mile, the clicking started again, distant at first, then gradually closing. It came from behind us this time, as if following rather than hurting. Don't look back, I instructed. Just keep moving forward. The terrain grew steeper, forcing us to scramble over fallen logs and navigate around dense underbrush. Each obstacle slowed our progress, allowing the sounds behind us to draw closer. The clicking accelerated, becoming more agitated. They're gaining, Josh said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt the bundle at my belt grow hotter, almost burning through the fabric of my pants. Acting on instinct, I pulled it free and held it aloft. The clicking stopped abruptly. Keep moving, I said, still holding the bundle high. I think this is working. We continued forward at a steady pace, the bundle seemingly holding our pursuers at bay. For nearly half an hour, we hiked in tense silence, the absence of clicking somehow more unnerving than its presence had been. Then, without warning, a scream tore through the forest, directly ahead of us. We stopped dead, confronted with an impossible choice. Behind us, the clicking had resumed, closing rapidly. Ahead, something waited, announcing its presence with that terrible cry. "They've surrounded us," Melanie whispered. I raised the bundle higher, turning in a slow circle. "We keep going forward," I decided. Hansen said straight east, no matter what. We resumed our advance, moving more cautiously now. The terrain began to level out, and through the trees ahead, I could make out what appeared to be a clearing, wider and more regular than a natural feature. "The logging road," Darren said, hope evident in his voice. As we approached the clearing, the clicking intensified from all directions, no longer just behind us, but surrounding us completely. The bundle in my hand began to vibrate, the feathers and bones trembling as if alive. 50 yards from what was indeed a crude dirt road, a figure stepped out from the trees directly in our path. It was one of them, taller than any human, limbs impossibly elongated, skin textured like bark. Its head was the worst part, vaguely humanoid in shape but with features that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, as if refusing to resolve into anything recognizable. It raised one arm, pointing not at us, but at the bundle I held. Understanding came with sudden clarity. The bundle wasn't protection, it was a marker, a tracker. Hansen hadn't been helping us escape. He'd been ensuring we remained within the creature's reach. I hurled the bundle toward the figure. It caught the object with unnatural speed, those long fingers closing around it precisely. For a moment it stood motionless, examining what I'd thrown. Then it stepped aside, clearing our path to the road. "Run," I said quietly. "Now." We broke into a sprint, covering the remaining distance to the road in seconds. The clicking followed but remained at the tree line, not pursuing across the open ground of the road itself. The road stretched in both directions, crude but definitely man-made, rutted from vehicle traffic. We turned left, moving as quickly as our exhausted bodies allowed, putting distance between ourselves and the forest edge. After about a mile, we heard the distant sound of an engine. A battered pickup truck appeared around a bend, driven by an older man in forestry service clothing. He stopped when he saw us, taking in our disheveled appearance with obvious concern. "You folks lost?" he called through the open window. "Hikers," I explained breathlessly. "We got separated from our group, been lost for days." He nodded, not questioning our story. "Hop in the back, I'm heading to town." As we climbed into the truck bed, I glanced back toward the forest. At the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, stood multiple tall figures, motionless, watching. The old forester followed my gaze but showed no reaction, as if he couldn't see what I was staring at. "Something wrong?" he asked. I turned away. "No, just glad to be found." The truck pulled away, carrying us toward civilization. None of us spoke during the journey, each processing the nightmare we'd escaped. The creatures hadn't followed, perhaps unable or unwilling to leave their territory, or perhaps simply satisfied with the test they'd administered. Hansen's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes they warn, sometimes they cull. We had been warned. Others had been culled. The distinction felt arbitrary, a matter of chance rather than merit. What made us worthy of warning rather than elimination? What criteria had we satisfied by reaching Hansen's cabin? The forester dropped us in a small town about 20 miles from the wilderness boundary. From there, we contacted authorities, reporting our experience as a simple case of hikers becoming lost. We mentioned nothing about the creatures or Hansen's cabin. Who would believe us? In the days and weeks that followed, I researched the area extensively. The Bitterroot National Forest has more missing persons cases per capita than almost any wilderness area in the country. Most are classified as accidents or exposure, the bodies never recovered. Official surveys list no permanent residents in the section where we encountered Hansen. The last staffed ranger station was decommissioned in the 1980s. According to records, all personnel were either reassigned or retired. I wonder often about Hansen, who he is, what bargain he struck with the forest guardians, how many lost hikers he's directed over the years. Was he once like us, tested and found worthy of a different fate? Has he become something other than human during his 40 years in those woods? I don't hike anymore. The others have similarly abandoned outdoor activities. Some nights, I wake to the sound of clicking outside my window, just branches tapping in the wind, I tell myself, though I never open the curtains to check. The forest tested us. We survived. But I can't shake the feeling that we're still being watched, still being evaluated. That the test isn't over, merely moved to a different venue. Sometimes they warn, sometimes they cull. The distinction, I've come to believe, is less important than the message. The wilderness has guardians, and they are neither benevolent nor malevolent, merely balanced in their own terrifying way. And in the deepest part of night when sleep eludes me, I wonder if they followed us home.